"Are they going to pump this out?" Alec asked as he stepped awkwardly into the flooded basement, the water rising to just below his knees. "I don't know," I said. "Aren't they renovating this place?" "I don't think so," I said. "It's just this mural they're after." "Well, we're gonna need it dry," Alec grumbled. "Can't run electricity down here like this. Gonna need it for the imaging equipment too." "Yeah," I agreed. "Plus, God knows what's in this water. Some of these tunnels must lead off to the catacombs." "You can't be serious," he cried, his flashlight suddenly snapping from one bare stone wall to another. "Are there actually bodies down there?" "It's a church," I said. "They buried people here. Not recently, but yeah, it has catacombs. Don't worry, they're not just stacked up like firewood in some room. There's gates and stuff to stop people desecrating them." Alec shone his light at the water lapping around his feet and curled his lip. It was the colour of old coffee. "I don't know how anyone can expect us to work in these conditions. For the money they're paying, I'd work waist deep in the Thames," I told him. "The guy's last painting sold for $7 million. Do you know how excited the church was when they found out he'd be down here in the 70s? Whatever he put on the walls, they charged them with vandalism then. But now there's money on the line. They want whatever he did restored, packed up and sold." Alec huffed. "Where's the damn thing anyway?" I stopped momentarily to get my bearings. "Down here." I waved him on, and we delved deeper into the basement as I led us through a strange mix of large rooms and awkward tunnels carved directly into rock, some of which you had to stoop just to fit. Many of the rooms we passed had old boxes in them. One had furniture draped with once white sheets that were now mouldy and stained. Another had an old piano, the lid still up. Thankfully, it wasn't far. A few minutes at most. Once we found the door, we both put our shoulders to it and forced it open. Water must have built up, because it came pouring out at waist height and nearly took us both off our feet. "Bloody stinks," Alec cried over the roar of water. But I ignored him. Once it was safe, we stepped inside, and it was as if our lights grew dimmer and the air colder. A distinct sense that we'd crossed the threshold. A long and empty room where the only sound was water dripping somewhere in the distance. I was about to suggest we'd taken a wrong turn, but then I saw one of the walls that had been painted black, and there was something strange about it. It was only when you let your eye linger that you saw the brushstrokes, no thicker than my thumb. They covered every inch of it and caught the dim light of our torches, shimmering with the brief flashes of iridescent colour that were impossible to focus on. The longer I looked, the more I saw the great depths in that work. The texture alone was remarkable, like you were up high and looking down on a vast stretch of unbroken ocean, roiling waves made of slick black water. And the colour? The closest comparison is what you see when you close your eyes. The whole thing made my stomach churn, but there was no denying its artistic merit. The kind of thing I could imagine hanging on a wall in the Tate Modern. No wonder the church wanted it restored and transferred out to the basement, but it would be no easy feat. It was huge. I don't feel too good." Alec wobbled momentarily before collapsing. I had to rush, but I managed to catch him before his head went beneath the water. "Damn," I hissed as I struggled to hold his weight with my arms beneath his shoulders. Panicking, I looked around for somewhere to put him, but the room was empty. If I let him go, he'd flop down and inevitably drown. But he was a big guy, and my arms were already getting tired. I had no hope of making it all the way back to the stairs, but I remembered that room was nearby, the one with the furniture. It'd have to do in a pinch. Struggling to keep him upright, I dragged him slowly through the murky waters. It wasn't easy. While the ground was firm, it was still irregular, and I was walking backwards through knee-high water. My mind fluttered through all the possible outcomes of this situation and inevitably focused on the worst. He could drown, get an infection, we could get lost. Those tunnels were tight and confusing. I could imagine it so very easily. The fear and panic of going around in circles. Rough-hewn stone wrapping in on itself, so every turn takes me back to that place as my arms grow ever more tired. What would I do in that situation, I wondered. Would I let him drown, or would I keep going until I collapsed from exhaustion? And how long would I last? A few hours, a day, maybe more? It was a silly idea, but it got my heart racing. Tried telling myself that I had it under control. I had a plan, a good one. Get him upright in one of those old chairs. He'd probably just fainted because of the air down there. Maybe he was more sensitive to it than most. But while I tried to keep my eye on him, watching for any signs of consciousness, I kept looking up at the tunnel ahead. With each step, the darkness felt heavier, and the lapping of the water grew so loud it seemed to almost hurt my ears. And yet, at the same time, I could hear my every breath as clear as if I was standing in total silence. Without any real reason for it, a cold dread crept over me. I didn't feel alone down there, no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it as a childish feeling. It just kept getting stronger. Each time I looked up, I expected to see something. God only knows what I thought would be waiting for me. But it didn't matter. The mere thought there was something in the dark or lurking beneath the water was enough to make me hurry, even as I kept reminding myself that was a great way to make a mistake. Thank God it wasn't far to the room with the furniture. There was no door, so I simply turned and plodded backwards until I saw a chair that looked good enough. Sure, it was disgusting and green with mold and mildew, but all it had to do was hold his weight. Alec is a good 6 inches taller than me and built heavier too, so by the time I lugged him onto the chair, I was exhausted and had to stop and catch my breath. Hands on my knees, entire body trembling, I took a few seconds to comfort myself before leaning over him and calling his name. "Alec," I cried. "Alec!" I gave him a few gentle pats on the face. He seemed to stir, but I couldn't say for sure. "For goodness sake," I hissed, hearing just the slightest hint of alarm in my voice and trying to suppress it. "Alec, wake up and let's get the hell out of..." Someone pressed the key on the piano, and everything inside me came to a screeching halt. It was dull and off-key, but there was no mistaking the sound that had come from the nearby room. The thought of there actually being someone else down there made my skin tight and my head ice cold. It took every ounce of willpower I had to stand upright and look towards the doorway. "Mike," Alec groaned, and I damn near jumped out of my skin. "I don't feel well," he muttered while rubbing his face. "It's so dark in here. I think I might be dreaming." As the initial shock left me, I was flooded with relief at no longer being alone in that horrible place. "You fainted," I said with as friendly a laugh as I could manage. "Must be the air down here. We'll need respirators from here on in." "I'm cold," he moaned as he pushed himself upright. "I want to go home. Can I go home, please?" "Damn right. I said while taking his elbow and leading him to the exit. I felt a lot safer knowing it wasn't just me facing the darkness, but I still found myself hesitating as we passed the next room along. "What is it?" Alec asked as he paused to look at the old piano. "Nothing," I muttered before hurrying us both along. Someone had closed the lid. "It's like a different painting when photographed." Marie pursed her lips as she looked at the camera display. "Something to do with how it catches the light?" She picked the tripod up and moved it several feet to her right. She pressed the button and the flash went off in the dark room like a bolt of lightning. For an instant, the whole place was laid bare. Roughly hewn stone and stagnant water. "Look," she called me over. "It happened again." I stopped my work setting up the fourth pump at the far end of the room and wandered over. So far, I'd managed to pump out most of the water, but it still lay an inch thick along the ground. Of course, the rest of the tunnels were still flooded. No hope there. So the room itself was sealed off. Sandbags at the only doorway, with further waterproofing from rubber tarps. I'd since spent days trying to figure out where the last of the water in that one room was coming from, and had been so busy chasing leaks that I'd had to hire Marie to help with the imaging. "It looks funny," I said as I leaned over her shoulder and looked at the latest picture. The wall appeared as an explosion of psychedelic colors, closer to a tie-dye t-shirt than the black obelisk it was in person. But it's a weird piece, very textured, and the paint itself is quite unique. I'm not surprised it behaves strangely under a camera's flash. "But look at it," she said. "I did," I replied while wandering off, unwilling to stare too long. "It's weird." "I don't like it," she said, before quietly moving the tripod another few feet along. "Me neither," I snapped as I knelt down next to the broken pump. "So let's get on with it. I need all the help I can get." "All right," she tutted. "Where's your partner in crime anyway?" "Alec's not been feeling well," I said. "Ah, that's a shame. Always liked Al." Another flash. For a brief moment, my silhouette was painted on the wall opposite the mural. I could have sworn it was a different kind of black, as if my shadow had texture, brushstrokes even. Before I had time to think about what I'd seen, Marie was suddenly standing by me. "Still no luck with that pump?" "Driving me nuts," I said. "Well, I want to set the x-ray up now. It won't take long, but we'll need to leave the room each time. Or at least I will, since this is something I do daily." I thought about staying in that place alone. "Screw it, I'll join you," I said. "Well, before we get going, I'm gonna need help getting it into position." "Sure thing," I said as I took a hand to get up. It was a big unit, designed to capture high-resolution images of what lay beneath paintings and canvases, essential for seeing the early work of a painter. In the few years I'd spent in the archives of the National Gallery, I'd always enjoyed documenting the strange artifacts found beneath famous paintings. Sometimes you could even see a timeline of the artist's process, preliminary sketches, features removed, background details added late into the process. Most people don't see there's more than one Mona Lisa lurking under all that paint. "Okay," Marie said as we manhandled the machine onto the first little yellow marker she'd put on the ground. "First to 4. I'll hit the timer, then we'll make our way to the corridor. It'll beep when it's done. Good to go?" I nodded, and she hit the button. We walked briskly to the exit and climbed over the barricade, pulling aside the plastic sheeting I'd draped over the doorway. Just as Marie was on the other side, we heard the beep telling us it was done. Then we were back inside, where she removed the plate put it into a waterproof duffel bag, and the process began again. Each time we moved it further down into the long room. Each time it took a little longer to get back to the exit. It was a pain in the ass, but necessary. "Last one," Marie exclaimed when we finally hauled onto the fourth yellow marker. "I'm actually curious to take a closer look at these pictures, you know," she added before pausing to look at the mural. "It's horrible to look at, but you have to admire the skill that went into it. It's almost, well, familiar." Her words trailed off, and she slowly tilted her head. I had to give her a nudge to remind her to press the button. She laughed, pressed it, and with that, we were both marching back towards the exit. I quickly climbed over the barricade once more, turned to help Marie, but found myself staring at an empty doorway. The machine beeped to say it was done, and I poked my head through the tarp and looked around, but couldn't see her. Confused, I climbed back in and scanned the room. Nothing. The machine was still there, humming away, but no sign of the woman who until just a few seconds ago was right behind me. "Marie?" I called out, but there was only the sound of dripping water. I was baffled. I couldn't understand where she had gone. She couldn't have gotten past me into the hallway. It just didn't make sense. But as the seconds turned to minutes, confusion was replaced with a chilling panic. "Marie!" I shouted again, and then again, and again. Each time my voice got a little louder and the repetitions grew closer together until I was pacing furiously, just screaming her name over and over. My voice grew hoarse. I even stuck my head out into the corridor and cried out, but there was never any response. I checked every inch of that place, and when I didn't find her, I checked every inch again. Part of me started to visualize her eventual return, to hope for it, started to imagine that moment of relief, the sight of her appearing at the doorway before explaining where she'd gone. I held on to that fantasy so hard that at times it felt as if I was alive in two worlds at once. One where Maria and I were laughing about a slight misunderstanding, and another where a woman could disappear into thin air. Surely the latter isn't reality, I thought to myself as I shouted over and over. This one has to be the dream. But if it was a dream, I wasn't waking up. And eventually, I accepted that I had to go get help. I didn't even grab my things before stepping out into the corridor. I was in a rush, desperate to get this nightmare over with, to get help and to find Marie somewhere safe and sound. But I only made it a few feet when I heard a voice call out to me from behind. "Mike, I don't feel so good. Am I dreaming?" She was leaning on the doorway I just left, eyes sunken and cheeks sallow. Even her hair looked thinner. She looked like a woman who just spent a week on a desert island. "Jeez," I cried before running over and grabbing her. She was close to collapse, wobbling back and forth and clutching the door just to stay standing. "Where the hell did you go?" "It's so dark in here. I want to go home," she said in a quiet drone, like a child that's been pulled out of a car crash. All right, I said. "Let me..." "What is that?" She was holding something in her hands. It was one of the plates from the X-ray machine. She didn't even register me taking it from her. Down in the dark, it didn't look like much, and being in a hurry, I simply tucked it under one arm and helped her over the barricade and into the water. Everything that followed was a rushed blur. I took her into the church, sat her on a pew, and called for an ambulance. Paramedics quickly arrived and rushed her off, asking a few questions here and there about what I think might have happened. I had no real answers to speak of, but when I mentioned she didn't have a respirator on her, they all seemed to take it as a given that she had carbon monoxide poisoning. That was the official diagnosis for Alec, and I recognized a few of the paramedics from when I called them out for him, so they must have connected the dots. But carbon monoxide poisoning didn't explain why she looked so thin and, I don't know, broken. She looked worse than awful. Seeing her in that state had terrified me. At least she's in safe hands, I told myself as I watched the ambulance doors close. I decided it was time to call it a day and went to grab some of the things I'd left on a nearby bench when I saw the slide Marie had been holding. The light was a little better in the church, especially since it was midday, and that broken roof filled the place with rays of amber light. I took the X-ray and held the back plate up, squinting to see what it showed. It looked like a hurricane of swirls and spiraling bone-white shapes, a confusing mess of strange distortions that reminded me distantly of the background of Van Gogh's Starry Night. Only there, in the middle of all those swirling, rolling lines and growths, was a woman. Marie, in fact. I was sure of it. And she had both hands clutched to the side of her head, like she was screaming for her life. "You saw it?" The old man who'd answered the door was practically skeletal, but he wasn't infirm. He glared at me with twitchy anticipation of my answer. He seemed ready to explode. "You saw the mural?" "Yes." "When my secretary got your phone call, I was ready to dismiss you entirely." Slowly, he looked me up and down like a piece of meat. "You look intact." I tried speaking, but something about the old man's intense stare caught me off. Noticing this, he pulled the door open and gestured inside his luxurious apartment with one arm. "Come in," he cried. "I had my staff confirm you really have done work in the church. I'm fascinated by what you might have seen." "I was told you bought Mr. Halswell's paintings," I said as he ushered me into a room decorated with gleaming hardwood furniture and beautiful red velvet wallpaper. "A collection at an auction," I stammered. "You spent quite a lot of money on them." "Yes," he replied while sitting opposite me. "Halswell was touched, you know. Spent his life trying to exorcise the things he saw." Right," I stammered. "I just wanted to know if you had any information on the mural at the church." "My boy, you've actually seen it, which makes you far more of an expert than I am." He spoke like he was giving me the greatest compliment. I never had the nerve to go look. I love my esoteric hobby as much as anyone, but I prefer the occult, where it is unlikely to do me any harm. "Well, I'm just concerned. I had 2 friends collapse in there, and one of them, well, I can't really explain it, but she went missing for a while. The church aren't a lot of help, but they told me to speak to you if I wanted some information about the artist." "Oh, the church has no real record of that place. Not properly, anyway." "What is it?" I asked, growing tired and wanting to cut to the chase. "What did George Halswell paint? I've had 2 colleagues pass out down there, and now one of them isn't answering my calls. Please, I need answers." "George didn't paint anything," he said with a shrug. He was sent down as a handyman and found it behind the crates of old rubbish. Whatever he saw, he felt compelled to paint over it, an attempt at censorship. He wanted to hide it away. That's why he was charged with vandalism by the old priest who is long since dead. But George's efforts were in vain. He could not unsee what he had seen, and it would stick with him forever. I don't understand. The mural is... He leaned forward and grinned. I could tell he was hoping for this. Yes, yes, he whispered. Tell me about it. It's not just tar on the wall, I said. It's more... It has a kind of depth. There are brushstrokes all over. Thousands, if not millions. They don't look like they form a pattern, but they do. It sits behind your eyes and burns the sinuses. It's an impression of something. The darkness inside a coffin. It looks featureless, but it isn't. Sometimes, it's as if it crawls. Fascinating. Well, the brushstrokes don't surprise me, he said while sitting back with a satisfied grin. George used his hands, but whatever he tried to hide, it didn't just go away because he painted over it. He didn't erase anything, merely changed it, gave it a different face to wear. But if he didn't make it, who did? He shrugged. Who knows? Those tunnels are so extensive because there were multiple archaeological dig sites held there throughout the 19th century. They found mosaics dated to the Romans' first arrival in Britain, along with pots and clay that were even older. Some say the church was built atop it to hide the darkness below, but that was too long ago for anyone to remember. When I called the Archbishop to check if they had really sent you down there, they seemed under the misconception George had created the mural from scratch, but the painting on that wall predates us all. His shoulders sagged, and a look of defeat took over him as he added, I wish I had the courage to see it. I was afraid. So often the truth can be frightening. When I heard Housewell's daughter was auctioning off some of his later works, I thought maybe this could be a chance to catch a glimpse of it, a way of seeing what George Halswell saw, as retold by him through new artistic expression. I sighed. This visit hadn't really told me a great deal so far. Sensing my disappointment, the old man smiled. Would you like to see them? His paintings? Suddenly, he was the spry and lively person who'd opened the door to me just a short while ago. He sprang to his feet and clapped happily. Come, 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 he said in a frantic tone. Come, there's something special. Whatever George saw down there, it really did a number on him. He wasn't taking no for an answer. He even reached out and grabbed my hand, pulling me along like an excited child until we arrived at a small room he'd decorated as a gallery. The walls densely packed with paintings and prints worth millions, some of which I recognized as worth millions. But he strolled past them like they meant nothing. When he shoved me eagerly in front of his newest collection, I understood why. Halswell's paintings were not pure black, spiritual relatives of the mural, but with just enough light to see things beyond. They were detailed and beautiful, at least in the artistic principles used to make them. The forms and anatomy, the use of color and space. But it was the contents that gripped me and made me nauseous. There were 7, all showing an array of people in various forms of torture and deprivation. Flaying, amputation, drowning. Bright white eyes stared at me from the wretched abyss. But it was 2 of them in particular that had me feeling like my heart was about to fall out through my stomach. They showed me Marie and Alec, thin and starved, weeping and broken, screaming into the emptiness as some unseen force dragged them into the icy black water. It shouldn't be possible. George Hoswell had died 16 years prior. There was no way he could have painted my friends. But there was no mistaking the people in those images. Christ, he'd even showed Alex's tattoo. "Whatever was buried down there and found by George," the old man said as he savored the shock and terror on my face, "is an open invitation to something no one wants to meet. I would say best of luck to you and your colleagues, but there's no point. You're already done for." "Al, come on, let me in." I banged on the door for the 10th time without reply. Last time I'd seen Alec was when I'd driven him home from the hospital after he collapsed, and that had been 3 weeks ago. I just assumed he'd gone to stay with his parents, like he told me he was going to do. But after I saw those paintings, I had a terrible feeling that something bad had happened to him. I called his parents, hoping he'd be there, but they told me they hadn't heard from him. Didn't even realize anything bad had happened. Half an hour later, and I was outside his door, doing everything I could to reach him. "Come on," I shouted before knocking again. "Marie's missing. Is she with you? Please, Al, tell me you're both okay." Anxious and scared for my friend, I put my ear to the door, hoping I might hear him approaching. There were only faint sounds of movement, irregular, the slightest suggestion of someone talking. "Al," I cried. "Al, please, open up." Something loud struck the door and made me jump, and that sinking feeling in my chest grew worse. He was alive at least, but that didn't mean he was okay. Even if it meant making him mad, I was going to have to get in there and check on him. Thankfully, I had a spare key from a long time ago and used it to pop the door open just an inch or two and peer inside. But there was only darkness. "Al!" I cried through the small opening, and immediately regretted it. Something about the smell of that place, mildew and damp, it made my skin crawl. And the carpet was soggy, like there'd been a leak no one had bothered to fix. It reminded me of the church basement. Not just the water or the smell, but the shadows, the distant sight of doorways leading into empty spaces wreathed in darkness. I didn't want to announce my presence in that place, but I had to let Alec know I was entering his home. "Alec? Alec, it's Mike. Are you in?" There was a muffled bump way off in the back, so I pushed the door open the rest of the way before propping it in place with a nearby extinguisher. The light that streamed in was feeble, but it offered me slight comfort. Unfortunately, I only took a few steps before the door slammed shut, and I was left in total darkness. Desperate, I grabbed my torch and turned it on, and what I saw nearly made me drop it again. There was someone staring at me from a doorway at the far end of the hall. Sunken eyes and pale skin, hair thinning so badly I could see the scalp, inflamed and raw. And that expression, a dull but hateful glare, the drooling gaze of a lobotomized killer. I didn't even recognize it as Alec at first. It took a few seconds of being gripped with terror before I realized it was my old friend leering at me from a darkened room. "Alec?" I stuttered. "Are you okay?" He said nothing. He simply stepped backward and seemed to dissolve into the very shadows. I summoned what little bravery I had left and took a few careful steps towards the doorway where he'd been, but I still couldn't see anything. Only when I stood so close that I had one hand on the jamb did I manage to get a good look inside. Alec was crouched in the corner near some broken furniture, nude and pale, spine jutting out between distended shoulder blades like a starved survivor. He was muttering quietly to himself, the same phrase again and again. I couldn't be certain, but it sounded like he was saying, "It's so dark in here." I wanted to call out to him, but the words were caught in my throat when I saw his blackened fingertips and the buckets of empty paint. He had remade the mural, or perhaps just some version of it. A dark and confusing mess of thick, glassy obsidian brushstrokes that covered an entire wall. His TV lay smashed on the floor where he'd pulled it down, his sofa pulled out, the coffee table tossed aside. It was like he'd been in a mad rush to get at the wall. Now, everything in that place was broken, taken to pieces, worse even. A lot of it was rotten, turning to filth and mold. It was as if the church basement was crawling out of that black wall, musty air and stagnant water seeping through the waxy paint to taint everything it touched. "Al," I said, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. "We need to get out of here, now." He looked at me with teary, desperate eyes. "He says, if you want us back, you know where to look." With alarming speed, Al jumped upright and ran towards the wall, where he disappeared into the paint like a rock falling into water. I thumped down into the water with a splash and immediately scanned the basement. Black water rippled away into the distance as my chalky light swept over old boxes and broken shelves. I tried everything to hold on to that sense of urgency and bravado that had compelled me to come rushing over to the church, but in the face of the aching darkness that lingered at the edge of my torchlight, I could already feel it slipping away. I knew I had to go marching into those shadows, deep into the tunnel at the far end of the room that would take me to the mural. I had to save my friends. Every time I thought about leaving them to their fate, I remembered that painting, the look on their faces, agony and torture written in such despairing eyes. If there was even a chance of reaching them, I had to try. And given Al's words to me in that apartment, there really was no doubt about where to look. Each step was a struggle. The sound of water drove my paranoia to new heights as I kept stopping, expecting to hear the footsteps of some unseen pursuer, or perhaps something up ahead. But it wasn't until I reached the room with the piano that I finally heard the sound of someone else down there with me. Music. I stopped, not quite sure whether I could trust my senses. Was I really hearing it? Or was my terrified mind just conjuring the worst-case scenario? But soon enough, the background noise died down, and clear as day, I could hear a dreadful song. A strange, discordant tone, weak and off-key, played with only the vague memory of real musical talent. Shaken with terror, I dipped my light in a desperate bid to make myself less visible, and approached the doorway. Marie was sitting there, waiting for me. I recognized her as my friend, but this was not the woman I knew. She had aged decades in the time since I'd last seen her, and grown so thin she didn't even look human anymore. And her eyes, beady and black, nestled above a manic and sadistic grin that was anything but joyful. "He's taking his time with you," she said in a lilting sing-song, before rising to face me, her broken, sagging body on full display with thick, knotted scars. This was not the woman I'd put into that ambulance. Maybe it was her after she'd survived a nuclear war. But no, it simply wasn't possible that she could have changed so radically in so little time. But that was her face, twisted with hate and a kind of hunger, but still her face. She looked ready to lunge at me, the tense anticipation of her coming. And I really didn't like the thought of those bitten yellow nails scratching at my face and eyes. But instead of leaping, she simply giggled and slid quietly into the water, disappearing beneath the black surface. I contemplated leaving and turned to look the way I came, but some 20 meters away, my light caught a glimpse of Marie's frightening face staring at me. I jumped, shocked at how she'd managed to slip past me and all the way over there without me noticing. And now she waited, daring me to try and leave. I wanted to march over there. But geez, the look on her face. I decided I had no choice but to move onwards to the mural. Maybe Alec would have come to his senses and could help me. A slim hope, but that was all I had to steel myself. So I walked slowly to the final doorway and stepped over the sandbags and into the room with the mural. Everything was where we'd left it weeks before. Even the old X-ray machine was on its tripod. Slowly, a kind of darkness seeped into my thoughts, and the air grew dense and fluid, filling me up like I was drowning in filth. I tried to keep my mind in order and work out the next course of action, but it was useless. I fell to my knees and started to heave, but the harder I fought for breath, the worse it became. Minutes stretched on as the edges of my vision pulsed red and black, and I realized it was as if I was drowning but could not die. And then a horrible notion started to burn its way into my mind. Slowly, it came to me as a powerful truth that all the time I'd spent outside that room was a lie. Just a kind of dream. All the daylight I'd seen, the mornings waking in my own bed, the sight of London's skyline, and the sound of a world made of bright and colourful things. Those memories were just a thin plastic over a far deeper truth. That room, Alex's collapse, Marie's disappearance, they were the only real things I'd experienced, and the cold and damp and dark were all that remained to me. There was no outside world. All of that was a dream. His dream. The only thing that really existed was the ocean on the other side of that wall, and everything else was dreamt up by something that lay in its depths. I nearly collapsed beneath the weight of those thoughts. Every breath was a struggle. Every moment I tried to recall from my old life was like passing a kidney stone. And then I heard it. A trickle. Looking towards the wall, I saw water seeping out of the paint like sweat from skin. Slowly at first, but then it grew and grew until the trickles turned to a steady pouring. Leaks springing in a dam that held back waters from another world. Eventually, it gave. All at once, a great and terrifying torrent of black water spewed from the painting. It did not last long, a few seconds at most, but it was enough to quite suddenly fill the room with another foot of water. and once the foam and crashing waves dispelled, I saw him, Alec, kneeling in front of the mural. "It's your turn in the dark now," he groaned, and all thoughts of rescue fled my mind as I looked at him. What had I even been thinking going there? What was I going to do against that? You couldn't fight it, couldn't stab it or kill it, and Alex's words had chilled me to the bone. God, no, I thought. No, I'm not going there. "He wants one of us back in there, and it's only fair it ain't me," Alec cried as he rose to his full height. Whatever he'd been through, he was in a far worse state than Marie. He wasn't just starved. He was falling apart, his torso covered in great, weeping lesions so large and deep that you could see exposed muscle and bone beneath. It was as if he'd been coughed up out of some giant's belly, half digested and barely alive. "No," I muttered. "No, no, no." "We had our turns," he screamed suddenly. "We went in. It's your turn now." I ran, launched myself over the barricade, and fled screaming down the tunnel. I moved through the water like I never had before. I wasted no time looking behind me, didn't even waste energy on thoughts of what was happening. There was only the need to drive one leg forward through the water like a piston in an engine. The burning in my muscles didn't matter. The thunder of my beating heart, so wild and furious it felt like I might just collapse and die at any second, didn't matter. None of it mattered. All that existed to me in those desperate few minutes of flight was the memory of the world above. Sunlight, birds, smiling strangers and delicious food, my home and my bed, a world where things made sense. I was crying when I finally reached the basement and saw the stairs leading up to the light. My heart quickened as I climbed up them on all fours, and my hand reached out for the final one when the world exploded. Pain. Red. Something like lightning seemed to shoot out of my mouth, spreading across my face in terrible pulses of agony. I had slipped and smashed my face onto the final stone step, catching the very edge of my bottom teeth, shattering them into shards that now floated freely in my mouth. But that wasn't what brought me out of the shock. No, what brought me back into awareness was the feeling of cold water rising over my shoulders and a hand clamping onto my ankle with almost machine-like strength. Alec had caught me at the final moment and was now dragging my floating body back towards the darkness. I wasted no time. I immediately thrashed and struggled to find my way back onto my feet as he turned and pummeled me with ape-like blows. "It's your turn," he bellowed. "We spent our time in the dark." In the frantic struggle, I saw Marie crouched in the corner and sobbing. "We're all his anyway," she whined like a petulant child. "We all have to take our turn, one way or another. He has us." She launched herself towards me, and I finally lost all desire to help my friends. I hit her as hard as I could, one solid blow in the face. That scrawny little neck whipped back, and she disappeared beneath the waves. Jeez, I still don't know if I killed her. I only know that from that moment on, it was just Alec trying to drag me back towards the mural. He'd always been bigger and stronger than me, and while he was a bone-thin ghost of his former self, he still held on to me with a steel grip, using one hand while he rained terrible blows down on my head with the other. Bloody and confused, I ended up using one hand to cover my face while the other groped desperately for anything I could use. Eventually, I found something, cold and wet and slick. An old piece of wood. I swung it as hard as I could, and it broke across his face like rotten mulch. He stopped and grinned. It hadn't even fazed him. But where the old piece of wood had broken, I now clutched the jagged collection of splinters. Gritting my teeth and tapping into what little reserves of anger I had left, I reached forward and drove the few inches of broken wood into the largest open wound of his gut. This time, he didn't grin. He screamed and let go of me, staring in horror at the filthy wood jutting out of his flesh. I wasted not 1 second more waiting for him to recover. I ran up the stairs and up into the open light of the church and slammed the trapdoor shut with a heavy, final thud. Alec and Marie were found unresponsive in their homes just a few weeks later. Not much was made of the painting on Alex's wall, nor the one Marie had apparently made herself. The police questioned me briefly, but seemed to ask a lot of questions about drugs. I think, based on the state of their homes, the police thought that Marie and Alec had been addicts. Flooding, mold, decay. I did ask the police to destroy the murals they had made in their homes, but they told me it'd be down to the landlord to deal with the repairs, although they said that both apartments would likely have to be gutted and rebuilt from scratch. Alec and Marie are still in hospital to this day, comatose. It was years before I summoned the strength to visit them, and even then, I never went further than the door to Alex's room. I merely lingered there and watched him for a moment, hoping that I might convince myself that everything that had happened was just some kind of sick dream. Hopes that were dashed when Alec briefly came awake and turned to me. "It's your turn in his belly," he said. "This life or the next, you're going there." He grinned before collapsing back into unconsciousness, and I left and never returned. Since then, I've worked a number of jobs, the sole requirement being that I never want to work on another painting again. Retail, construction, factories, anything, so long as I don't have to pick up a brush or look at one's work. Alex's words in the hospital have frightened me so deeply that I doubt the fear will ever fade. Each night, I dream I'm back in that basement. Others, I'm in a timeless void and something terrible is looming towards me. A mouth bigger than most football stadiums, ringed with teeth several stories high. But the worst are the ones where I'm trapped, suffocating in total darkness as some invisible fluids burns my skin. But no matter how much I scream or cry, I can't claw my way to freedom. Instead, the more I thrash, the more those ribbed mucus-covered walls seem to compress around me until I can hardly breathe. These dreams are growing more frequent, and recently I have begun to worry that Alec and Marie were right. It is my turn in the darkness. It has always been my turn. This life or the next. It's where I'm going. Or maybe I'm just going mad. After all, I woke up this morning to paint all over my hands, and the beginnings of something strange daubed in filthy finger streaks upon my wall. I had a lot going on during the pandemic. My dad passed away from an unrelated illness, and lockdown was driving me mad. I'd always been a bit paranoid, but being locked inside turned it all up to 11. My home was converted into a makeshift prison, an asylum where I was supposed to be my own caretaker. I didn't have much trouble switching to remote work. I usually worked with exclusively overseas clients anyway, so the only thing that really changed was the software, the chair, and my pre-rendered background. But as days turned to weeks, it became increasingly obvious that I wasn't okay. I'd sleep anywhere from 2 to 12 hours a night, and with no discernible pattern. I'd wake up crying without knowing why. Sometimes I couldn't even open the bathroom door, as I tricked myself into believing there might be someone on the other side. Having lost my dad, I was feeling more mortal than ever. The news, the internet, and the radio were all saying the same thing. Going outside was the end, and at that time in my life, I couldn't handle more death. Everything feels different when you're forced to stay inside. The walls seem closer, and your chest tightens. It feels like the air grows thinner, warmer. You can feel your breaths enter your lungs, but they don't sustain you. Your knickknacks and doodads look like souvenirs from a place you can't go back to. A mockery like notches on a prison wall. Sometimes when I slept, I'd forget what was going on. Waking up, the nightmares would fall on me like a rock, knocking the air out of my lungs. I'd grow increasingly scared of going to sleep, as if that rock would grow heavy enough to crush me. And yet, it was all better than going out there, among the others. I couldn't take a step outside my door. Even if the lockdown was to be lifted that same day, there was no way for me to convince myself that everything was going to be fine. Nothing was fine, and it wouldn't be for some time. My colleague, Dana, was the first to take notice. I'd been up for about 53 hours. She pulled me into a chat after a remote meeting, telling me I looked sick. I melted. I poured my heart out about anything and everything, barely forming a coherent sentence along the way. If someone asked me to recall what I said that day, I could only hazard a guess. Dana tried to understand, but must have realized this was above her pay grade. I get it. It's a lot right now. It's a lot for all of us, she said. It might be time to talk to someone. She reminded me that we had an agreement with one of our main partners, Hatchet Pharmaceuticals. They handled our health insurance, which also included mental health treatment. In fact, they'd expanded on it since the start of the pandemic. They got a remote counseling program, she said, holding up a brochure. Just use your company login and sign up for a session. What do you think? There wasn't much to say. I was willing to try anything. I filled out a questionnaire and got a response within a couple of hours. I was sent a link to a calendar app and got to pick a name from a list. There were a couple of short descriptions by each available counselor, giving me a bit of insight into what kind of person they were. There was a man named Gareth who had an empty calendar. It was strange. See, each counsellor could be sorted by seniority and number of patients, and Gareth was at the top. He was, by a good margin, their most experienced employee. So how could his schedule be so empty? I signed up for a session with Gareth the next day. It felt like a stone settling in the pit of my stomach. I was nervous, and I didn't even know why. Maybe it was the prospect of changing routine that scared me, or maybe it was the thought of opening up to a stranger. Either way, it affected me way more than I thought it would. I went back and forth on cancelling the whole thing. I wandered around like a cat on a hot tin roof, feeling the walls closing in. I ended up on the floor, gasping for air, curled up like a ball. I just wanted it to be over. I took a day off work to have my first session. It was just past lunchtime. I'd prepped a cup of Earl Grey and a microwave cinnamon bun as comfort, but that wouldn't stop my hands from shaking. I got a pop-up on my screen with a blue sunflower logo. Clicking that connect button felt like dipping my heart in ice water. Gareth popped up in a little video feed. He was a man in his late 50s with combed back salt and pepper hair. He had bushy eyebrows, a trimmed goatee, and a white shirt with a black tie. It looked like he was in a large office with wide, open windows. It looked pleasant, airy. "Good afternoon," he smiled. "I'm glad you could make it. It's difficult to take that first step on a new path." "It really is," I nodded. "But I'm glad you did," he said. "Now, how about we talk a little bit about who we are? Would that be all right?" We took turns talking about ourselves. We shared our names, our professions, our age, and a little bit about our families. Gareth was 57 years old and had worked as a mental health professional for 23 years. He had 2 sons who lived in Philadelphia, just like my mom. We spent some time talking about how we adapted to the pandemic and how we felt about having to stay inside, wear masks, and the way it affected the way we looked at other people. I barely noticed it, but Gareth had accidentally made me reveal my issues without me even realizing it. He was good. Real good. I had told him about how difficult my life felt, that I felt trapped in my own home, but that the outside was even worse. "You're describing it like you're sailing on a frying pan on a sea of fire," Gareth said. "Like there's no way out. That must be stressful." He was spot on. I felt hopeless, like spiraling down a black drain. But he just smiled and nodded. "We can work with this." I decided to see Gareth twice a week. I could book any time I wanted. His calendar was wide open. I wanted to ask him about it, but I didn't. There was a part of me who didn't want to get too personal. Gareth seemed nice, but he was also just doing his job. I was asked to sit by an open window during work hours as an exercise, a way to get used to the sounds of the outside world. It was nerve-wracking. Every passing car felt like a freight train, and every stray voice from a passerby felt like a threat. But slowly, day by day, it turned to background noise. And with that, the world started to feel a little bigger. The walls breathed again. Over the next few sessions with Gareth, we tried a couple new exercises, leaving the window open while I slept, leaving the front door unlocked during work hours, and by our 4th session, he asked me to try something new. "About half an hour a day, right before you go to bed, I want you to open your front door," he said. "Stand or sit there, taking in the sounds of the city." That night, I tried it. I opened the front door and sat down. I tried to mentally record everything I saw, one thing at a time. The walkway down the road, the ill-kept playground. I counted the cars, the windows on the nearby buildings, the light posts, the parking meters. I put some conscious thought into observing things from a new perspective. But through it all, the one thing that made me want to go back inside was the sight of other people. It wasn't just the threat of a spreading pandemic. People seemed nefarious to me, ill-willed, dark silhouettes roaming about in the night. Their wants and haves a mystery. If the news were an indicator of anything, everyone was struggling to make ends meet. Everyone was a potential assailant. At best, they were indifferent. Perhaps I had it all wrong. Maybe it wasn't the virus closing my throat that was the greatest issue. Maybe the real problem had been people all along. Looking at the nameless shapes staring at me from the windows across the street, that sentiment felt more true than ever. The more sessions I had with Gareth, the more I realized my priorities were changing. I was letting go of my claustrophobic tendencies, but I couldn't help but to feel threatened by the people around the neighborhood instead. Gareth seemed very interested in this, asking me to describe my feelings and mapping out my day. It was very thorough, and I got new exercises to deal with my anxieties. I was asked to record my nightmares and worries. Another day, I was asked to write down stray thoughts on paper. Another, we had a session about how to practically deal with intruders and how it made me feel that there might be people out there who wanted to harm me. We talked about the many ways people could disappoint you and how easy it was to retreat from the public. But I didn't get a good read on Gareth. It seemed to me like he wasn't really trying to treat me anymore. The exercises he suggested did little but to zoom in on the worst feelings that lingered in the back of my mind. My anxieties were emphasized, not examined. But one thing that remained was my nightly routine to sit with an open door, looking out over the neighborhood. I'd stopped mapping the objects I could see, instead focusing on the neighbors, strangers walking past in the night. I convinced myself that they wanted my money, my car, my brand name clothes, all of it. I had this feeling that if I were to leave my place for a night, I'd come back to it being ransacked. If I came back at all. It was easier to just stay inside. One of those nights, however, I saw something. On the other side of the ruined playground, there were a series of row houses. One of the doors were left wide open. I could see the shape of someone standing in the doorway. I could have sworn they were looking straight at me. They didn't move. Were they trying to figure me out? Was this a warning? Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about this potential someone. It's as if I could see them everywhere, and Gareth wasn't helping. He was asking me to describe them, both physical attributes and their actions. It became a bit of a hyperfixation, and I couldn't stop myself from seeing them in the corner of my eye. But the fact was, something was happening out there. I'd see that same person every night, staring at me from across the street. I'd hear footsteps outside at night. Sometimes when I slept, I swear I heard someone messing with my letterbox. It felt ridiculous, and I knew I was exaggerating. But was it really all make-believe? It was a Tuesday when, once again, I logged in to have a session with Gareth. The weather was rough, and some construction work had cut off my high-speed internet. I had to rely on spotty mobile Wi-Fi, and the approaching storm didn't help. Gareth connected, but it took a bit longer than usual. He had the same half smile as always. I noted that he seemed to have good weather, which was a bit of a surprise. I thought he lived in the area. "Mr. Martin," he said, "I'm glad you could join me." I froze. I checked my webcam, making sure it was working properly. The resolution was a bit spotty, but there was no question about it. My face was clear enough. "My name's not Martin." Not only should Gareth know that, but he could also see and hear me. It was very strange. I was caught off guard. "Of course," I said. "Wouldn't miss it." Gareth sat completely still, looking straight ahead. He was silent for almost a full minute, then sort of sprung to life. I thought that maybe the storm was interrupting the Wi-Fi, but it seemed to be working fine. Maybe there was an issue with Gareth's calendar app. Then again, if it was the case, how come he didn't recognize me? "Have you been keeping up your exercises?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I have." "So, let's hear it then," he continued. "What did you learn?" "About what?" Gareth leaned back in his chair and chuckled. It was a warm sound, but there was something hollow in it. The screen froze, and in a heartbeat, he was back to leaning forward, looking straight into the camera. "About your target." I barely had to say anything. This Martin person had come to Gareth for an issue similar to mine, something he had diagnosed as general anxiety disorder. It seemed like Gareth had poked and prodded Martin in a way that focused their issue on an external threat. Other people. A neighbor. I stood up, stepping away from my laptop, but leaving the conversation running. I peered out my living room window. "What do you think I'll do to this neighbor?" I asked. "We've talked about this," Gareth responded. I know, I repeated, "but I want to hear what you think." "I'm afraid you might murder them." I looked back at the screen. Gareth just stared straight ahead, not moving a muscle. No emotion, just a matter-of-fact statement. I felt the moisture on my tongue evaporate as something sour crept up my throat. "And what do you think about that, Gareth?" I asked. He didn't blink. A full 20 seconds of silence passed. The only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat. "I think you're going to do what you need to do to heal," he said. "And I want you to heal, Mr. Martin." "At any cost?" "Of course." There were a couple of people outside, passing by in the night. Someone with a thick coat, another with a trucker cap, one with a backpack, another on their phone. Some with their hands in their pockets, someone holding something dark. A gun, a knife. But no one stepped up to my door. No one came knocking. But there was someone standing in an open door on the other side of the playground, looking my way, like they'd done so on so many other nights. Maybe they were making a difficult decision. The meeting with Gareth ran out of time, and I dove onto the net. My hands were shaking so much I could barely spell. I checked it all. The name of the program, the pharmaceutical company, Gareth, everything and anything I could get my hands on. There wasn't much to see. Paper trails came to sudden ends. Names were scrubbed or removed. Most people working on the platform were hired as outside consultants, and there was no way to trace what kind of money they were moving or where. And Gareth, he was a puzzle piece. For everything he told me, none of it was specific enough for me to look up. There were no names of his children for me to track, no address where he lived, no mention of his previous place of employment. Running out of options, I called up my colleague Dana. It was 11 p.m, but I had to get answers. Dana was skeptical, but she could tell I was upset. She wasn't enthused about getting back in front of a computer, but I got her to look up a couple of things. It didn't take long for her to find something curious. "Hatchet has a company policy about billable consultant hours," she said. "They have a maximum number of billable hours. If someone goes past this, they need to be hired as a full-time employee." How does that relate to their remote platform? Gareth and a handful of others go way above this average. They ought to be full-time employees, but there's nothing that says that they are. So they're bending their own policy a little? So what? There'd be a paper trail, she continued. We have a close association with them. We got access to their meeting protocols. Policy exemptions need to go through the board. So the only way I see it, there is only two ways to make sense of this. She took off her glasses and leaned into a camera, lowering her voice. Either this program is run illegally, or these people don't exist. I thanked Dana and got back online. There was no way I'd be sleeping that night anyway. A stray thought hit me, and I got back on the calendar app. Even now, in the middle of the night, Gareth was available. I booked an immediate meeting with him. That gave me an idea. Using my phone and a separate login, I checked his calendar again. According to it, he was free, despite me having booked that time already. So, I booked him again. 2 calls at the same time. And at the same time, a connect button popped up on my phone. I clicked both buttons at once. Gareth popped up with the same smile as always, sun shining from his open windows. "Good evening," said Gareth on my computer. "Everything alright?" asked the Gareth on my phone. There were 2 of them. They were talking at the same time. I turned off my phone and leaned back. My pulse was rising. I had no idea what I was even looking at anymore. I'd been paranoid about people for weeks, maybe months, but there'd been a mystery in front of my face all along. "You're not real, are you?" I asked. "Of course I am," he laughed. "I'm right here. Is this what you need to discuss? Are you having issues separating fantasy from reality?" "No," I spat back. "No, you don't get to do that. I'm not imagining this." "Then I don't know what to say," he shrugged. "I'm as real as can be. I'm right here." "Then how come you're saying 2 different things on 2 different screens, Gareth?" Gareth didn't answer. He looked off screen as if considering something. He looked back up at me, still smiling. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I have an urgent patient issue that I need to resolve." My laptop shut off. Seconds later, my phone went black, and someone was coming up the stairs. Before my heart could skip a beat, something slammed into my front door. I raised my arms as if to shield myself from the sound, and a second later, I heard the hinges buckle and snap. Then, something broke. Something splintered. I rushed to my kitchen, passing the entrance. There was someone standing by the broken door. I only saw them in passing, dressed in dark, ill-fitting clothes. I grabbed the first sharp thing I could get a hold of. Armed with a kitchen knife, I backed myself up against the wall, knocking over a few doodads in the window. It was a long way down, but if I had to, I'd rather have a shot at breaking a leg than dying. But I couldn't get the damn thing open. A stranger stepped into the hallway. About 6'3", dressed in a navy blue hoodie and a black leather jacket, leather gloves curled around an honest-to-God machete. A face obscured by a burlap sack with holes poked out around wide-open green eyes, shoulders heaving with excited breaths. He rushed forward, grabbed one of my kitchen chairs and threw it across the room. It broke against the wall, knocking over a photo. Shattered glass covered the floor. Something whistled past my left shoulder and slammed into the kitchen tap with a metallic clang. It made my ears screech. I steadied myself against the kitchen table, and it was casually tossed aside with a crash. I headed straight for the door. For the first time in months, I didn't consider my anxieties. I had to get out. Then something cold grabbed my neck. Leather gloves. I reached back with my kitchen knife, but lost my footing on the broken glass. I was sent tumbling to the ground, landing hard on my shoulder. I looked up to see a raised machete and those sparkling green eyes. I had to say something. Anything. "Mr. Martin?" It was the first thing that came to mind. The machete hung in the air, ready to fall. He hesitated. "You're Mr. Martin. You're speaking with Gareth, right?" There was no response, just excited, heaving breaths and a shaking machete, frozen in place like a living statue. "He's tricking you. Us. He's tricking us. He's not real, Mr. Martin. He's not real." Something clicked. A heavy boot stepped to my wrist, kicking my knife away. The machete crept closer, cold steel resting on my chin. I felt the warmth leave the tip of my fingers. "I win," a hoarse voice wheezed. "I got you first. I'm not playing any games. I'm not." For the first time, he blinked. He tilted his head. I continued. "I'm not playing, Mr. Martin. You can't be first if I'm not playing." "You were trying to get me first." "No, I wasn't. You're lying." The tip of the machete pushed into my skin, shaving a couple of hairs and cutting a 2-inch gash across my jaw. Pain like sharp ice spread across my face. Then, a noise. A loud electronic noise. My phone. It must have come back on. Martin stopped. He was having trouble hiding his glee. He was giggling like a schoolboy. This was funny to him, if anything. "Answer it," he chuckled. "I want them to hear." I took my phone out. It was Dana. "Answer it," he repeated. "Put it on speaker." So I did. Dana's voice came through. Something about what we'd talked about had kept her up as well. She had always been the kind of person who couldn't let go of a good mystery. "You gotta hear this," she said, going straight into a rant. "I think I got something." I held up the phone for Martin to hear as Dana explained her findings. It turned out the program wasn't supported by our healthcare deal. It was just registered as a support feature, and it was included in the same paperwork. It was never literally spelled out as a health service. Looking into the fine print, it was specified as a technical support feature. "You get it?" she laughed. "They're not a mental health care provider. They're hired to handle data collection." "What?" I whispered. "They're gathering data. That's their primary function. Data like mental health problems, stress-related issues, ages, locations, trends, dreams, wants, or how fast they can get us to kill one another." Dana laughed. I looked up at Martin. He wasn't laughing. The machete pierced my phone as he flicked it across the floor. His eyes sunk. He didn't look as excited anymore. His shoulders slumped with a loud sigh. "You're not playing?" he wheezed. "No, I'm not." He took his foot off my arm. I could feel the warmth running back into my fingertips. With a casual stroll of someone heading to the supermarket, he headed for the exit. Without looking back, he shared a few parting words. I would have won. Over the next few days, we lost access to the program. Dana and I couldn't do or say anything. Turns out they had baked more than we'd anticipated into the terms of service. It explicitly stated that it was an experimental service and wasn't to be used as a substitute for conventional mental health care. It was all just data collection. Some artificial program meant to get people talking, engaging them, and pushing them to tell more and more and more. Not aiming to help them or guide them, but to get them to return, talk, and stay engaged with the platform. And this Martin guy? Turns out there was no neighbour with that name. There was, however, a man who'd been found dead in the row house across the street, slashed to pieces and kept in plastic bags in the bathtub. Someone had been squatting there since the beginning of the pandemic. Someone who the neighbours described as a strange man with bright green eyes. I think Gareth was just keeping this murder engaged, poking him to go further, to do more, and to stay occupied. I don't think it was a conscious decision. It was just algorithms. Oddly enough, I think my paranoid tendencies have eased. As the pandemic came to an end, I figured something as absurd as this whole thing won't happen to the same person twice. No matter what I run into out there, I don't think it's gonna be another killer. It's freeing in a way. If I can survive this, I can survive anything. Unless Mr. Martin thinks I'm ready to play. It was during one of our fights, after the screaming had turned into an uncomfortable silence, that Kira had suggested it. Maybe we just need to get out of here, start somewhere new, she said with a trembling voice, staring at the wall. I honestly did not think it would solve anything. Would a change of scenery really be our saving grace? But as I looked into her eyes, we were desperate. I realized that when you reach your boiling point, any solution seems better than a lack thereof. We had been grasping at straws for months. Between the arguments, sleepless nights, and the growing depression between me and my wife, Kira, it felt like our little family was getting unraveled day by day. We were suffocating. Kira and I met in high school, and our once fiery romance was now reduced to ice-cold embers. The sort of love that had simply grown too familiar, too accustomed and too routine, soiled by years of exhaustion, stress, and the demands of raising Lily. Our fights had become unbearable. Insignificant things like dishes left in the sink or unwashed clothes would explode into massive shouting matches, and neither of us could stop. Kira's eyes were now hollow, and her laugh, which used to make me feel like I was on top of the world, had become all too rare. We were losing ourselves entirely, and our sweet little girl was caught in the crossfire. She had become quieter. She clung to her toys, her eyes masked with sadness, watching us from the corner of the room as if she understood far more than we ever gave her credit for. The drive to the town was quiet, but I could tell we all had hope for our future. It felt like we were shedding our skin, leaving behind layers of hate and resentment, the ghosts of our past, 1 mile at a time. We did not speak much during the trip at all. The hum of the tires against the road filled the vehicle interior, accompanied by the low murmur of the radio and Lily's humming from the back seat. Around late afternoon, we left, trading the city skyline for wide roads and endless fields stretching on forever. The sun was setting as we neared our to-be hometown. The air outside the car grew cooler, fresher in a way. I cracked the window, breathing in my surroundings, feeling the weight of the past few years lift, if just slightly, off my chest. Kira seemed a little lighter too. She glanced out the window, a small, hopeful smile playing on her face. Lily had fallen asleep at this point, her little hands clutching a stuffed rabbit tightly. I let myself believe, if only for a moment, that this move might actually work, that we could escape. The road led us down a winding path flanked by towering pines. The canopy grew thicker, blocking out the little sunlight that was left. I glanced at Kira, who was staring straight ahead with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She caught my eye and offered a reassuring smile. Finally, we pulled into the driveway of our new home. The house was small, a cozy old build that stood in line with the many other houses like it. It was adorned with a neat yard and a white picket fence that framed it like a postcard. I felt a flicker of hope once more. Moving in was a sort of blur of activity. Boxes stacked and nestled in every single corner, inside and out. Lily ran around the house with joy as she explored her new room. Kira and I worked in tandem, and I realized this was the first time we had truly done something together in a long time. It started to reignite the reason we married each other all those years ago. We almost finished unpacking when we met her. I was unloading the very last of the boxes from the car when I noticed her standing at the end of the driveway, watching us. An older lady dressed in a sweater and long skirt with silver hair tied into a bun. She had a thin, angular face, her age showing with each crease and fold of her skin. But her eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone her age. There was something just a tad too vibrant about her, as if she was much younger than she looked. "Hello there," she called in a sing-song tone. She waved as she walked up to my family and me, a plate of cookies in her hand. Kira and I smiled and waved back, nervous but excited to meet some of the locals. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, offering the cookies she had in hand. "I'm Margaret. It's so lovely to see a young family move in." "Thank you," Kira replied, grabbing a cookie off the plate. I forced a polite smile as Margaret's gaze drifted behind me to Lily, who had just wandered out of the house, her stuffed rabbit in hand. Margaret's smile seemed to widen, her eyes lingering on Lily. It looked like she was sizing her up. "You have a beautiful daughter," Margaret said, her voice soft. I cleared my throat and straightened my posture. "Yeah, that's Lily. She's the light of our lives." Margaret's eyes flicked up to mine, her smile steady. "I'm sure she is, and she's so full of life," she said, as Lily excitedly darted in and out of the house. As we exchanged basic pleasantries, I noticed a small girl standing behind Margaret, whom I had not noticed before. She looked to be around Lily's age, but there was something off about her. She stood perfectly still. Her face was pale and her eyes dark, lacking any expression or life. Margaret's voice pulled me back to reality. "If someone hasn't told you already, there's a wishing well that is a town's tradition to use. You should take Lily there. I'm sure she'll love it." "The wishing well?" I said, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. Yes. Margaret's tone shifted slightly. It brings good fortune to those who offer a wish and toss a coin. The well has been part of this town for generations. I'm sure you will want to give it a try. Many have. I paused and then nodded, unsure of how to respond. I was on the far side of superstition, never putting much stock into that thinking, and my wife was the same. But how her eyes gleamed when she spoke about the well made it look like she was dead serious about it. There was something strange about her enthusiasm, almost like she was too eager. She waved goodbye and walked back toward her house, with a small girl slowly shambling like a zombie behind her. As soon as she was out of sight, I turned to Kira. That was really odd. Kira shrugged. She's probably just one of those overly friendly neighbors. Besides, it's a small town. Of course they're gonna have their traditions. That was a fair reasoning. But something about the woman put me on edge. I tried to brush it off as the usual unease I get when I meet new people. Over the coming days, the town felt like a breath of fresh air. The change in the atmosphere did wonders for our little family. Despite my doubts, the tension between us eased, and Lily seemed to thrive in the open space and yard. The town was quiet and quaint, with charming little shops adorning every corner, and the locals were friendly. It was the perfect place for us to restart. But something stayed on my mind. The well. It kept coming up in conversation in places where it shouldn't have. In the grocery store, a cashier mentioned it in passing. "The well changed my life," she said with a smile that stretched her face. At work, my new co-workers casually talked about how the well had fixed their relationships and increased their pay like it was normal. Everyone was talking about something relating to the well everywhere I went and turned. The same eerie tone was in their voices, and the exact same too happy expressions. Everyone had some sort of story, how they'd wished for a marriage proposal, good health, a new job, and their wishes apparently came true. It was always talked about with a strange mixture of playfulness and a sense of caution, as if it was something much more serious, but also a joke. One evening, as Kira and I sat in the living room, I finally mentioned it to her. "Have you noticed how people keep talking about that well?" She laughed, but it was a nervous laughter. "Yeah, it's a little weird, isn't it? Everyone seems so obsessed with it." I agreed. It's like they're all selling the same story. Kira's smile faded. "Maybe we should just ignore it. Let's not question it in case it insults them. It seems to mean a lot here." And for a while, we did. It began with the small things. Despite my efforts, my hours at work were cut down, and my co-workers became colder and more distant. The town, which had felt so welcoming when we first arrived, seemed darker and gloomier. The sky constantly seemed overcast, and the air felt heavy. The roads became littered with trash, not overwhelmingly, but noticeably so. It felt like some unseen force was pressing its weight down on us. Kira's mood shifted too. The happiness we'd found after moving seemed to slip away from us. She became quieter and more withdrawn. The fight started again, sharper and crueler than before. Was the excitement of moving here the only thing that placated us? I was frustrated at our situation, that we were unraveling again, and I didn't know any way to get my frustrations out. That night, after a particularly brutal argument, I found myself walking through the town and forest, the cold air biting at my skin. I just wanted to clear my head away from the situation. Usually, I walked until my head cooled and then headed back, but the argument was so heated that I just kept walking and walking. I hadn't meant to go this far out, but I ended up deep into a trail in the woods. This somehow led me to the well. Though the well was often mentioned, I had yet to actually know where it was. No signs marked its location, so it must have been known only to the locals. The old stone structure stood in the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by tall, twisted trees. The moonlight cast long shadows over the moss-covered stone, making it look like something out of a painting. My breathing slowed to a crawl. I did not know why I arrived at the well, but in desperation to get my life back on track, my mind returned to all the glowing testimonies I had heard about the well. I did not take this town's tradition seriously, but I was desperate and helpless. I needed to get my family out of the hole we were in. I approached the edge of the well and looked down into the abyss. The walls were smooth and slick with age, and a faint metallic and earthly scent rose up to meet me. There was no real movement, no wind or swaying of the trees, just an eerie silence of an impossibly empty forest. I felt like the trees were watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. Then, she appeared. Margaret. Her presence made me flinch. How had she gotten so close to me, so quietly, I wondered to myself. She stood about 10 feet away from me, her face bathed in moonlight and a smile even wider than before. There was something strange about her once more, something predatory. "You came," she said, her voice like the shuffling of dead leaves. I didn't mean to," I stuttered. My hands gripped the cold stone rim of the well. She moved closer to me, her eyes gleaming with something I wasn't able to place. Satisfaction, perhaps? "It's okay," she purred. "It's all right to feel lost. But this well, it can help. It's helped so many before, and will help many after you." I swallowed, noticing how dry my throat was getting. "I don't know if I believe that, Margaret." Margaret tilted her head like a curious animal, her smile unwavering. "Belief isn't necessary here, only the action you take." She paused briefly, and her eyes locked onto mine. "You've been struggling. I can see it in your eyes. The feeling that it's not enough, no matter what you do. This well can change that." Her words filled my mind like poison. I had tried everything. Kira and I had tried meditating and couples counseling, and now we have even moved across state and started fresh. And yet, our problems remain steady. I had nothing to lose. Margaret's eyes slid down toward my hand. "A coin," she whispered, "and a wish." I didn't even remember reaching into my pocket and pulling out a worn and dull quarter. My heart raced and my fingers trembled as I held it over the maw of the well. My back was turned to her, but I could feel Margaret's smile grow sharper. "Make your wish." I hesitated. I did not know what to wish for. Happiness, peace, for Kira and I to stop fighting. I did not know. I just wanted things to be okay. I wanted to have my family again, a semblance of control. I muttered the first thing that came to mind. I wish for everything to be better. The coin slipped from my fingers and tumbled into the darkness below. I never heard it hit the bottom. For a moment, nothing happened. The world stood still. I could feel Margaret watching me, waiting. And then she laughed, low and soft. "That's all it takes," she said, turning and walking away. I stayed momentarily, hoping to feel something divine wash over me, before realizing how childish this all was. So I headed back, following the trails I had walked to get there. I woke up drearily, tired from the previous night's long hike. I slowly made my way to the kitchen, fully prepared for a snide argument with Kira before seeing Lily off to school. She held back the shouting for when Lily was not around, but the passive-aggressive comments somehow hurt worse. When I got to the kitchen, my nose was hit by a heavenly smell. Pancakes. I don't know how, but Kira made pancakes that could put the best breakfast franchises out of business if she were ever to go pro. She smiled at the table, her plate waiting for me. I sat down, cautious but optimistic, and we did something we had not done in a long time. We laughed over breakfast, something we hadn't done since our first few days here. Lily was more animated, running around the yard with a wide grin on her face that made my heart swell. Things were somehow better. The improvements became undeniable. My job picked up again, my hours were restored, and I even got a sizable raise. Kira was happier and more engaged. The arguments stopped entirely, and they were replaced with quiet, peaceful evenings spent watching TV or reading something together. We were invited to neighborhood barbecues and town events. At these events and at my job, people congratulated me for finally making my wish. I thought it was weird how they knew, so I figured Margaret informed everyone. It took me a while to complete the town's tradition, but everybody was happy, and I was finally, officially, part of the town. It was late one evening when the first cracks began to show. I was in bed, half asleep, after an outing with some friends I had made in the neighborhood, when Lily's scream shattered the silence. My heart nearly exploded out of my chest as I leapt out of bed, rushing to her room. Kira was right behind me. We burst through the door to find Lily in her bed, her eyes wide with pure terror, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest, shaking. "Mommy, Daddy, there's a monster outside my window," she cried, and pointed towards the window with a trembling finger. I ran over, throwing the curtains aside, but saw nothing, just the night sky and the faint outline of the trees beyond. I let out a sigh of relief and tried to calm her down. I told her it was just a bad dream, but the look in her eyes was all too real. She was terrified. "It's real, Daddy," she whispered. "I heard it talking to me." We tried to reassure her to the best of our abilities. She calmed down when we let her sleep in our bed with us so we could protect her from any monsters if they came back. This made her feel safe enough to fall back asleep and rest enough for school the day after. However, this was only a short-term solution for what became a long-term issue. The screams came again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, Lily was more petrified than the last, more insistent that something was just outside her window. Her childish demeanor faded, replaced by dark circles under her eyes and constant anxiety. She became quiet and withdrawn, and this affected us too. The sleepless nights caused my performance at work to worsen. Then, one night, she didn't scream. This would ordinarily be a sign of progress with the issue, but I still wanted to check up on her. I crept up to her room to avoid waking her if she was deep asleep. I was met with a cold draft of wind when I opened the door. The window was open. The curtains fluttered in the cold breeze and her bed was empty. I sprinted outside and shouted her name into the empty street with no regard for the neighbors, who were probably all asleep. I received no answer apart from the echo of my own voice. The street stood still, and I felt my heart beating. Kira was in a state of complete disrepair, sobbing, screaming, unable to collect herself whatsoever. She was inconsolable. The only thing I could do was call the police. When they arrived, they were disturbingly calm. The senior officer, a burly man with greying hair, simply nodded along as I explained what had transpired. Still, his eyes showed no signs of urgency or concern. "She probably just ran off," he said with a shrug. "Happens all the time around here." I stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean she ran off? She's 7 years old." He gave me a sort of placating smile. "Don't worry, she'll turn up. They always do." There was something horribly familiar about his tone. The same tone I had heard from the townspeople when they talked about the well. It made my skin crawl. A younger officer stood at the side of the senior officer, and he looked uncomfortable. His eyes filled with something like pity, and he avoided my gaze. I wanted to scream, shake them, to make them understand that my daughter was missing, but it felt like no matter what I did, they wouldn't take anything I said seriously. The senior officer said, "Call us if she doesn't come back in 48 hours. And they left. Kira collapsed into my arms. Her sobs racked her body. I did not know what to do. I felt powerless, as though everything was against us. The next 48 hours were hell. I scoured the town. I knocked on doors, asking anyone I could find if they had seen Lily. Every response was the same. Calm, detached. No one seemed to show even the slightest bit of concern. Some people even congratulated me, as if losing my daughter was something to be celebrated. It made no sense. Nothing did. While canvassing the streets, I would hear whispers. Conversations behind doors after I'd finished asking them for information about Lily. I tried to listen in, attempting to pick up any information they were withholding from me. I heard some familiar words I'd heard a lot in my time in this town. Tradition and well. I tried changing my tact from asking about Lily to asking about the well. I tried to be indirect, but it seemed word of Lily going missing was known across town. So every time I got close to understanding, someone would interrupt me with a smile and others with congratulations for making my wish, and never expanding beyond that. I was a complete wreck by the time the 48 hours were up. Kira shut down completely, refused to leave the house and barely spoke. I was spiraling. When the police returned, a different senior officer accompanied the younger one. I screamed and shouted at them that the 48 hours were up and that they had to look for my daughter now. The senior officer looked at me with a confused expression. "Why did you wait 48 hours to inform us?" "What?" I stammered. "You should have notified us as soon as she went missing. The likelihood of a missing child being found drastically decreases the longer it has been," he said with authority. I was stunned. There was so much I wanted to say back, but the thoughts swirled in my head so much that I couldn't pick a single train of thought to stick to. So I just stood there, mouth agape, emotions mixing within me rapidly. The younger officer then interrupted and asked the superior officer if he could take notes for the case. The senior officer nodded in agreement, looking disgusted as he left the room. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously. "This happens more often than you'd think." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He hesitated, glancing at his superior just standing behind him. "There's nothing we can do. The senior officer came back in and cut him off. It seemed he was listening from just outside the doorway and pulled him away before he could finish. "We have everything we need. We will do our best to find her," he grumbled before leaving. I tried to get his attention and ask him about what was truly happening, but they just left. I needed to find answers, and the only clue I had to go off was she. And the only person that came to mind about all of this was Margaret. That night, I went to knock on the one door I had been avoiding this entire time, but there was no answer. I wanted to take this as a sign that this wasn't the right line of thinking, but in my mind, I already knew where to find her. I followed the trails through the thick woods and arrived at the well. Margaret was waiting for me, her figure bathed in the dim glow of the moon once more. "You understand now, don't you?" she said, her voice almost gentle. "The well gives, but it also takes. You wished for a better life, and the well granted it. But there is always a price." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "What price? What are you talking about?" "Did you really think the price of everything you got would only be a quarter?" she asked, stepping closer. "And you made a pretty big wish." I panicked, shaking my head, trying to piece it all together. "You've already made your wish," Margaret said coldly. "But there is still time. You must choose, as we all have before. Your daughter, or your wife. One will stay, one will go." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to run, that this was all superstitious nonsense, coincidence at its finest. But I couldn't deny that what was happening was real, and that this was my last piece of agency. "You have about 24 hours from now," Margaret said before walking away. "Make your choice." I wandered aimlessly back to the town. I was getting consumed by the reality of the impossible choice I had to make. I thought of Kira, broken and lost, and Lily, her innocent face twisted by fear. How could I choose? The next day went by in a blur, lost in thought about everything. But in the end, I made my decision. In the dead of night, I knocked on Margaret's door. My heart pounded in my chest, still unsure about all of this. She answered this time. Her eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction. "Have you made your choice?" I swallowed hard, my throat constricting with emotion. "I choose my daughter." Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable. "It will be done," she murmured, and closed the door. It was so unceremonious, and yet my insides felt like I'd swallowed glass. That night, I lay beside Kira and looked at her, unable to sleep. She was completely unaware, oblivious to what was going to happen, to what I had done to her and our family. My heart was on the brink of tearing from guilt and sorrow, but there was no other way now. I drifted off to sleep, and she was gone in the early hours of the morning. I woke to an empty bed, the space beside me cold and undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle or a fight, no trace of where she had been. I couldn't cry or scream. I was numb, hollowed by the weight of what I had done. I heard a frail voice calling to me from down the hallway. I rushed over to where I heard it, and when I opened Lily's door, there she was. She stirred from her sleep as if she had never disappeared, just as Margaret had promised. But she wasn't the same. She was a shell of the bright, happy girl she had once been, silent and withdrawn, her eyes dull and lifeless. She stared at me, but there was barely any recognition and no warmth, just an emptiness that mirrored my own. Days later, as I stumbled through town, I saw her, the little girl from Margaret's house. She was laughing, running down the street with a group of children. She wasn't the pale, lifeless figure I had seen before. The stark contrast from when I first saw her woke me from my stupor. She was full of life now, compared to the shambling zombie of a child when we first moved in. And I realized that Lily now resembled that shell. She had been drained before, just like Lily. The well had taken Lily's life, and now it had given it to her. This must have been Margaret's wish, and she had tricked me into paying the price. I stood there in the middle of the street as the cold reality finally washed over me. This was how the town worked. There was no bureau to complain to about this, no authority that operated the rules. I couldn't get one back on her. Margaret played the game, and I lost. But now, I was a part of it. As I neared my house, I noticed the for sale sign on a house a few doors down. If I wanted Lily to be back to how she was before, I had to play the game, just as Margaret did. Maybe it's time for another family to make a wish. "You guys ever hear of the Silent Zone?" Eric said when he first brought up the idea. "Some old local rumor about part of the forest where no sound exists." The plan had started as another escape. Eric, Rachel, Megan, and I needed a break from the noise, The constant hum of the city, the stress of work, and the endless barrage of emails and notifications. We did this for years by going camping, always chasing that sense of freedom that only nature could offer. But this time, we wanted something different, something truly remote. Rachel rolled her eyes and leaned back in a chair. It sounds like a bunch of superstition, probably something to do with the acoustics or the natural sound barrier, her tone dripping with skepticism. Could be interesting. Might be nice to actually experience some real peace and quiet for once, I added, half joking, though part of me was intrigued. A truly silent area sounded perfect for that. Eric had found the spot while digging through obscure online hiking forums. It wasn't on any official maps, and that made it perfect. A remote patch of national forest far off the beaten path, where few hikers dared to venture. The main attraction, though, was a legend that came with it. That idea stuck with us. The silence, as eerie as it sounded, had a strange appeal, a break from the constant noise of modern life, exactly what we were after. The trip was set, and we were excited to disappear into the wilderness for the weekend. The drive out was long but familiar. Miles of winding roads led us deeper into the national forest, the trees growing denser as we left civilization behind. By the time we parked at the last trailhead, the car felt out of place in the thick woods. "This is where we head in," Eric said, pointing at a barely visible trail. It was faint, cutting through the brush, almost like it didn't want to be found. Rachel checked her phone one last time. No signal. Well, here's to being completely off the grid. We packed up our gear and began hiking. The mood was light. We laughed and joked about how far off the map we were going, and Rachel, the resident skeptic, continued to mock the legend. "Maybe the silence will swallow us whole," she joked, grinning as she pushed through the brush. Eric led the way, moving confidently down the narrow path. The trail wasn't marked, but it was clear enough to follow. For the next few hours, the forest felt normal. The leaves rustled in the wind, birds chirped in the trees, and our boots crunched against the packed earth. Everything was peaceful, just what we'd hoped for. As the sun began to set, we decided to make camp for the night. At this point, we were miles from the nearest road, with nothing but wilderness stretching out around us. The air was crisp, and as Megan gathered wood for a fire, the familiar sounds of the forest played in the background. A soft wind through the branches, the occasional distant hoot of an owl, insects buzzing in the underbrush. But as we sat around the fire that night, the conversation slowed, and I noticed the first hint of unease. "You guys hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Rachel looked up. "What?" "It's quieter than it was before. The forest," I muttered. Eric paused, listening. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the faint hum of insects, had grown distant. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it felt like the forest had dialed everything down. "We're probably just deeper in than we've been before," Eric said, shrugging it off. "This far out, it's normal for it to get quieter at night." Rachel nodded, but the tension lingered. The silence wasn't total, but it was there, creeping in around the edges. The next morning, the group packed up and continued deeper into the forest. We hiked for hours, the trail growing fainter, the trees closer together. The further we went, the more the quiet settled in. By midday, We were walking in near silence, save for the soft crunch of our boots and the occasional murmur of conversation. Megan stopped at one point, her face tightening. Seriously, do you guys feel that? It's like the air's pressing down on us. I nodded slowly. The strange stillness, the way their voices seemed to fall flat. Eric, the ever-steady one, waved them on. We're getting close to the area I read about. Probably just the geography or something. It'll pass. But as we trekked further, the forest grew quieter still. The birds had stopped singing, the wind had died. Even our footsteps seemed to lose their sound, muffled by the dense, heavy air. By the time we reached the second campsite, the silence was more than just unsettling. It was palpable. No wind, no animals, just the oppressive weight of quiet closing in around us. Okay, Rachel muttered as we set up camp, her voice barely more than a whisper. Now it's getting weird. Eric gave her a tight smile, but he couldn't deny it anymore. Something was off. As we sat by the fire, staring into the void of the darkened trees, the silence swallowing the sounds of the crackling flames, it was as if the forest itself had absorbed everything. And beyond the glow of the fire, there was only silence. The morning started out like any other. We packed up camp, shook the night off, and got ready to hike deeper into the forest. I could feel the tension from the night before, but none of us mentioned it. Eric was his usual self, leading the way, talking about how great it was to be so far away from everything. Megan was right behind him, pretending she didn't notice the quiet pressing down on us with each step. Me? I was at the back, watching them walk ahead, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. At first, it was just like the day before. The usual forest sounds, birds, winds in the trees, leaves rustling underfoot. But as the morning dragged on, the sound seemed to fade. Not all at once, just little by little, until it was hard to tell if it was the forest that was getting quieter or if my brain was playing tricks on me. By noon, it was impossible to ignore. The silence was thick, if that makes any sense. You could feel it pressing against your skin, your ears straining to pick up any noise at all. No birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves anymore. Just the soft crunch of our boots on the path. Except even that was fading. It was like the forest was swallowing everything. Megan spoke again, her voice sounding too loud in the dead air. It's weird, right? Like there's no sound at all. It's unsettling. Eric glanced back at her, trying to keep things light. You're letting the Silent Zone story get to you. It's just the woods. We're probably imagining it because we're thinking about it too much. But even he couldn't hide the unease creeping into his voice. I could feel it too. By the time we made camp that evening, the silence was impossible to deny. It was oppressive, like a weight on my chest, making it harder to breathe. We sat around a fire, but even the flames seemed quieter than they should have been. The crackling was there, but it was faint, muffled. The fire barely made a dent in the silence that surrounded us. Rachel was sitting across from me, her face lit up by the firelight. This doesn't feel right, she said, her voice low. I've been in quiet forests before, but this is too quiet. Eric smirked. We found it, the Silent Zone. We should be proud of ourselves. Rachel didn't smile back. Neither did I. We didn't talk much after that. Every time one of us spoke, it felt wrong, like our voices didn't belong there. I kept glancing over my shoulder into the dark where the firelight didn't reach. It felt like something was watching us. I hadn't said it out loud, but the thought had been gnawing at me all day. The quiet was doing something to me, messing with my head. It was too perfect, too still. We moved on. Eric, Megan, and Rachel were a few steps ahead, moving slowly. None of us wanted to admit it, but the sense of dread was growing stronger. The silence wasn't just eerie anymore. It was starting to feel dangerous. The quiet seemed to wrap tighter around us every minute, suffocating every sound before it even had a chance. Megan slowed, looking around, her face tense. "You guys hear that?" she asked, her voice sounding dull, as if it too was being swallowed by the air. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. Hear what? For a split second, I thought I heard it too. A snap, maybe a twig breaking in the distance. The kind of sound that should have been impossible in this dead zone. But then, just as quickly, the forest went silent again. We stood still, waiting, listening. Megan's eyes darted around, scanning the trees. I swear I heard something like normal noise. Eric glanced back at us, confused. Maybe it's just, I don't know, an echo. Maybe things are just weird here. He kept moving, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. A few minutes later, something strange happened. We passed through a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch of ground where the trees parted slightly and sunlight bled through. The air here felt different, lighter almost. Rachel and I exchanged glances, noticing the shift. Then, as I took another step, I heard it. My own footsteps. For the first time in hours, the crunch of my boots on the ground actually sounded like sound. Real sound. Megan's eyes widened, and she looked down at her feet, stomping lightly. "You heard that, right?" she whispered. Eric stopped and turned around, confused. "What are you talking about?" I tried it too, stomping harder this time. The noise was faint, but it was there. A crack, like someone snapping their fingers in a room too big to echo. It wasn't much, but after so much silence, it was deafening. I hit my water bottle against the rock for good measure, the clang just barely audible, but sharp, piercing through the heavy quiet. We all stood still, looking at each other, almost hopeful. But then the silence crashed back. The moment passed like a window slamming shut, and everything went quiet again. Eric smiled weakly, trying to act like nothing was wrong. "Just a weird spot," he muttered, picking up the pace. I wasn't so sure. There was something off about that clearing. For a second, we had real sound. But the silence kept pressing harder as we walked. There were no more sounds, no more fleeting moments of relief. Megan and I exchanged uneasy glances as we moved through the trees, both of us clearly remembering what we had heard. However, neither of us wanted to say it out loud. It wasn't an echo. Something had let the sound through, but we couldn't explain it. By the time we made camp that night, The silence was crushing again. We sat around the fire, our bodies hunched, every movement feeling more laboured than the last. The fire crackled softly, but even that sound felt faint, like it didn't belong there, like it was being muted. A little later, I noticed Megan had gone quiet. Her eyes locked on something just beyond the firelight. Her body was tense, like she was ready to run. "What is it?" I asked, my voice too loud, too sharp in the silence. She blinked, shook her head. I thought I saw something over there." She pointed towards the trees, where the shadows flickered in the firelight. Eric laughed, but it sounded forced. "Probably just your imagination. It's dark, the fire's casting shadows. It's easy to see things that aren't there." But I could tell Megan wasn't convinced. And honestly, neither was I. I followed her gaze, staring into the dark. But there was nothing. Just trees and shadows stretching endlessly into the night. "It's nothing," Megan said finally, shaking her head. But her voice was tight, and she kept glancing towards the tree line, like she expected to see something move again. I knew that feeling. The longer we sat there, the stronger it got. That feeling that we weren't alone. When we finally crawled into our tents, the silence felt even heavier. I lay there, staring up at the fabric, straining to hear anything. A breeze, a bird, even the sound of my own breathing. But there was nothing. We set out early the next morning, but the moment we stepped away from camp, I felt it. The silence had deepened, worse than the day before. At first, I thought maybe my ears were clogged or something. But no. The air itself was thick, heavy. It pressed in on me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. Rachel broke the silence. "Is anyone else having trouble, I don't know, breathing?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but she was right. Even my breaths felt shallow, like the air wasn't properly reaching my lungs. When I tried to speak, it felt like my voice was fighting to break through something dense, like the air itself was absorbing the sound. Eric denied it, though he didn't sound convinced. He was a few steps ahead, leading the way, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He was a few steps ahead, still leading the way, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. We kept moving, but it was getting harder. The silence wasn't just around us anymore. It was in us, pressing down on our lungs, muffling our voices, dulling our thoughts. Every sound we made, even just stepping on the ground, was swallowed up almost instantly. I stopped for a second, taking a deep breath. Maybe we should turn back. Eric shot me a look, his eyes narrowed. "We've come this far. We're close to the summit. Let's just finish the hike, alright?" Rachel didn't say anything, but I could see the unease on her face. I felt it too, but we kept going. What else could we do? The further we went, the worse it got. The silence was spreading, following us, maybe even growing. Any noise we made, Eric shouting ahead to check the path, me stomping my boots on purpose, was swallowed up so fast it felt unnatural. There wasn't even an echo. Nothing bounced back. The sound just died. Rachel tried talking, making small conversation to break the tension, but her words felt distant, like she was talking through a thick wall of glass. Everything we said was muffled. It felt like we weren't even there anymore, like the forest was swallowing us whole. The more we hiked, the more dread crept in. It wasn't just the quiet. It was something about the way the air felt. It was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We stopped for a break, setting our packs down under the trees. That's when Megan froze, her eyes locked onto something in the distance. "I saw it again," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What?" Eric asked, looking around. She pointed toward the trees, her face pale. "Something moved." I followed her gaze, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just shadows and the faint rustle of branches. "There," she said again, her hand trembling. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. That's when I saw it. A shape, elongated, dark, moving between the trees, quick and silent. It slipped out of sight before I could get a clear view, but it was enough. My heart started racing. "We need to leave." Rachel opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, but there was nothing. Panic flashed in her eyes as she looked at me, waving frantically to get our attention. I could barely breathe. It was like the forest had taken not just the sound, but the air too. Eric was standing still now, his eyes wide. "I think I see it." I nodded. We all had. We made our way to where we had camped last, tracking back towards our starting point. That night, at camp, the fire crackled mutely. The flames danced, but the sound was barely a whisper, barely a flicker against the overwhelming stillness. We sat, huddled together, no one saying a word. What was the point? We couldn't hear each other anyway. Megan kept looking over her shoulder, and I didn't blame her. I could feel it too. Something was out there, lurking, waiting, watching. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. "We need to go now. It hasn't attacked us, but we don't know what it wants. We need to leave." Eric didn't respond at first, just staring into the flames like he was in a trance. Finally, he shook his head. "We can't. Not in the dark. We wouldn't make it out." He was right, but staying here felt worse. I glanced at Rachel, her face pale and drawn, and I knew she felt the same. But the silence, it was so heavy, so complete, that we couldn't even talk about it properly. It was crushing us. The fire kept burning, but it gave off no heat or sound. We were alone with our fears, suffocating under the weight of the silence. And out there, beyond the flickering light, something was waiting. That night, lying in my tent, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The silence had become unbearable, pressing in on my ears and my chest. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was like the world had stopped moving, like even time itself had slowed down. But worse than the silence was the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept staring into the darkness, sure that at any moment I'd see that shape again, slipping through the trees, watching us. I could feel it. It was out there, waiting for something. I woke up before dawn, though woke up doesn't feel like the right word. since I never really slept. When I finally unzipped my tent, the cold morning air hit me, but even that felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. I glanced over at Rachel and Eric's tents. Then my eyes landed on Megan's empty sleeping bag. At first, I didn't process it. It wasn't until I stood up and walked over that I noticed the rest of her gear was still there. Her boots, her pack, everything. I called her name, but my voice felt muted, barely breaking the thick air. No answer. "Rachel?" I shouted louder this time, though it still felt like I was yelling underwater. Rachel stumbled out of her tent, rubbing her eyes. What's going on?" "It's Megan," I said, my voice tight. "She's gone." Within minutes, we were all on our feet, scanning the area. But there was nothing. No sign of her leaving. Her boots were still next to her tent, her bag untouched. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of a struggle. Just silence. Rachel started pacing, running her hands through her hair, her breath coming faster. "Where did she go? She wouldn't just leave like that." Eric was standing still, his face pale. "Maybe she went to the woods to... I don't know. Maybe she got up in the night and wandered off." I shook my head. Without her boots, and she would have said something. We would have heard. But that was the problem, wasn't it? In this forest, you couldn't hear anything. Not the wind, not the birds, and certainly not someone vanishing in the middle of the night. We searched for hours, calling her name, but our voices felt like they were swallowed whole, barely carrying past the trees. We walked in circles around the camp, looking for any sign of her. Nothing. It was like she had been wiped away, erased from the world without a trace. The panic hit Rachel first. She was pacing again, tears welling in her eyes. I could see her hands shaking, her breath coming in short bursts. She was barely holding it together. Eric tried to calm her down, but I could hear the tremor in his voice too. "We just need to stay focused." I didn't say anything. I was trying to think, trying to figure out what to do. But we couldn't stay here. Not after last night. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow. Just another trick of the firelight flickering through the trees. But as I stared, I realized it was moving. Not swaying like a tree in the wind. Moving. A tall, grotesque figure just beyond the edge of our camp. "Eric," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze, and I heard him suck in a breath. What the hell? It was just standing there, still as death, watching us. Its body was twisted. Despite its size, it made no sound. Not a whisper, not a rustle of leaves. Just silence. Rachel turned, her face going pale. "Oh my God." The creature didn't move, didn't step closer. It just watched. Eric panicked, grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the thing. But when the rock hit it, there was no sound, no impact, no noise, just the sight of it falling to the ground as if it had never been thrown at all. The silence swallowed everything. My chest tightened. The thing didn't flinch, didn't react. It just stood there, shrouded in shadow, the dark swallowing its features. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, It turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing into the dark. We stood there, frozen, none of us speaking. What was the point? There were no words, just the weight of the silence, heavier now than it had ever been. It pressed in on us, squeezing the breath from our lungs, wrapping itself around our throats. Rachel was trembling, her eyes locked on the spot where the creature had vanished. We have to go, now. Eric didn't argue this time, neither did I. We moved to the tree line, ready to follow the trail back. I see something, I muttered, and both of them turned to look. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. A jacket. Megan's jacket. It looked like it was discarded on a dried up log, but the sleeves were attached when I pulled on it. I yanked it up, and the log snapped with a sound that never came. That's when I saw that it wasn't wood, but the dried up remains of Megan. She was sucked dry from all her moisture and more. Drained wouldn't come close to describing it. How that happened in the span of hours was beyond me. Rachel's breath hitched and she stumbled forward, her hands shaking as she reached down to pick it up. It was heavy, soaked with something dark and sticky. Rachel backed away, her hands trembling. No, 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 no. Eric grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her gently. We have to go, Rachel. Megan's gone. We can't stay here. You saw that thing. It's still out there. We'll die if we don't leave, now. Rachel's face crumpled and she nodded, her eyes wide and glazed over. Okay. We packed up in silence, or what passed for packing when every movement felt sluggish, like the air itself was resisting us. I couldn't get the image of Megan's jacket out of my head. She was dead, and we had to get out before the same thing happened to us. Eric led the way, moving faster now, but it felt like we were fighting the forest. Every step was harder than the last, like the ground was sucking us in. My lungs burned, struggling to take in the air that didn't seem to exist, and the silence was unbearable. I tried to keep up, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. Rachel was ahead of me, her eyes wide, her breathing erratic, but at least she was moving. I tried to call out to them, to tell them that we needed to move faster, but the sound died in my throat before it even reached my lips. We started running, or at least we tried. It didn't feel like running, more like moving through a bad dream. Everything disoriented, like the world was working against us. Every step felt like it took twice the effort, like the ground was pulling us back with every movement. My lungs were on fire, my legs shaking with exhaustion, but I pushed forward, not daring to look back. Then, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, maybe a root, maybe a rock, and I hit the ground hard. No sound, not even the thud of my body hitting the earth. It was like the world itself had erased the noise before it could happen. I tried to push myself up, but it felt like the silence was pulling me down, suffocating me. I called out for Eric, for Rachel, but nothing came. The silence swallowed my voice whole. And then I looked up. There was something in the trees just ahead of me, a tall and grotesque shadow watching me from the edge of the clearing. The creature had been following us, watching us struggle, waiting for the right moment. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my body being pulled down into the earth, into the suffocating void. I reached out, but Eric and Rachel were already too far ahead, the forest closing in around them. Eric and Rachel didn't notice I'd fallen behind until it was too late. The silence engulfed me completely, swallowing me whole. I wasn't gone, not completely. I could still see them, hear the faint whispers of their panicked breaths. I watched as they ran, stumbling through the trees, their movements slow and disjointed. They didn't know where they were going. The forest had twisted itself around them, distorting their path. And then they reached the clearing. They stumbled into the open space, gasping for air. But it didn't matter. The silence was there too, thick and suffocating, pressing down on them. It was so intense now that it became physically painful. I could see it in their faces, how they winced with every step and breath. And then the creature stepped into view. It was taller than I remember, its body twisted and unnatural, its limbs long and thin, like shadows come to life. It didn't need to move aggressively or chase them. Silence was its weapon, its way of crushing them without lifting a finger. Eric tried to scream, tried to make some noise, but his voice was gone before it left his mouth. Rachel fell to her knees, clutching her head, her face twisted in agony. The creature just stood there, watching, letting the silence do its work. Eric and Rachel made a desperate attempt to run, but it was hopeless. The silence twisted everything, their senses and perception of time. They were moving in slow motion, stumbling through the forest that felt endless now. They didn't know if they were moving in the right direction. Maybe they weren't moving at all. I wanted to scream, to tell them to stop, to tell them to fight back. But I was gone. The silence had taken me too. All I could do was watch, trapped in the void, as they ran into the endless, suffocating silence. I couldn't bear to be left behind, so I heaved with all my might and got one knee under me. A few heavy breaths later and I got my other foot perched, and with the effort of an Olympic lifter, I performed the hardest squat of my life to stand. All the while, the creature was just watching at the edge of the tree line. I stumbled, slowly at first, and picked up to the fastest pace I could, which wasn't much, determined to catch up to Eric and Rachel. The light was starting to bleed through the trees. Dawn. The pale glow of the morning should have been a relief, but the silence was suffocating, heavier than ever. Every breath I took felt like it was being stolen from me. Up ahead, I saw Eric and Rachel barely moving, each step like they were wading through thick mud. The trees were thinning out, but it didn't matter. The silence was inside us now, a crushing weight that no amount of daylight could lift. The air felt thick in my throat, smothering my screams before it could escape. It didn't matter how close the road was. It felt like the forest itself was fighting to hold us back. Then, Rachel collapsed. 1 second she was walking, the next she hit the ground, face down in the dirt. No sound, not even the thud of her body hitting the earth. Her face looked gaunt, like she hadn't eaten in days. Eric stopped, gasping, and bent down to pull her up, but I could see it in his face. He was losing it. His hands were shaking, his breaths shallow and desperate. He tried to lift her, but the silence seemed to cling to him, weighing him down, making every movement harder than it should be. We're not going to make it, I heard myself think. The silence wasn't letting go. Eric crouched over Rachel, pulling a limp body toward him, trying to get her to her feet. I staggered over, my legs burning, barely able to hold myself up. "We have to get her up," I gasped, though I couldn't hear my own words. No sound. He looked up at me, panic flashing in his eyes. I can't." His voice came out like a whisper, even though I knew he was shouting. He tugged on her arm again, but it was like pulling against concrete. Rachel wasn't moving. For a second, I thought he was going to leave her. I thought maybe we'd have to make the choice, leaving Rachel behind or risk being swallowed by the silence ourselves. But then something flickered in Eric's eyes. Determination, or maybe just desperation. Either way, he wasn't going to give up. He grabbed Rachel by the shoulders, and I moved to help him. We heaved her up, but her body was heavy, too heavy. It was like the silence had wrapped itself around her, pulling her down into the earth. For every inch we lifted her, it felt like the forest pulled her back. I glanced behind me, expecting to see the creature, but the shadow was gone. That was almost worse. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, closing in, pressing in on us from all sides, like the silence itself was alive, ready to crush us at any moment. Eric was still pulling Rachel along, her body limp, barely able to stand. I wasn't far behind, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature was close. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, hidden just beyond the edges of my vision, watching us stumble through the trees like prey. Rachel fell, collapsing to her knees with a thud that made no sound. Eric dropped beside her, his face contorted in panic, trying to lift her back up. But she was barely responsive, her eyes half closed, her breath shallow and quick. "We have to keep moving," Eric muttered, his voice shaking. He was trying to pull her to her feet, but she was too heavy. It felt like the air itself was pulling her down. I tried to think back to times when my body felt light, without the oppressive silence weighing down on me, trying to mentally motivate myself. We'd been in this nightmare so long, I struggled to think of a time when things were normal. Suddenly, a thought flashed through my mind of my most recent memory of clarity. The clearing, the one from the other day, where the silence had broken, just for a second. It had been brief, barely noticeable at the time, but now it felt like our only hope. Sound had returned there, even if only for a moment. I scanned the area, my eyes darting through the trees, and then I saw it. The route leading to the same clearing, just ahead, highlighted by the rays of light penetrating the canopy of branches. It wasn't far, just past a cluster of trees. "Eric," I hissed, my voice barely audible. "The clearing, it's up ahead. We have to go there." Eric looked up, confused and frantic. "What are you talking about? We need to get away, not further in." But I didn't have time to explain. I grabbed Rachel's other arm, and we half dragged, half carried her toward the clearing. The creature was closing in. I could feel it, the silence growing denser with every step. My chest felt tight, my head pounding from the pressure. But I pushed forward. We didn't have a choice. We broke through the trees into the clearing, and for a split second, just like before, I heard it. The faintest sound. My boots crunching against the dirt. Rachel's ragged breaths, too loud in the oppressive quiet. The silence was weaker here. Eric was panting, his eyes wild with fear. "What do we do? We can't stay here." I placed Rachel down, using this place to let her rest, and as I lowered her, I heard a loud rattling as she hit the ground. I looked down at the metal canister on Rachel's back, my hands trembling as I pulled it off. The water bottle, heavy and metallic. I didn't know if it would work, but we were out of options. I slammed it against the ground. The clang rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the quiet like a knife. It was faint, but it was real. Sound. For a moment, everything stilled. Even the oppressive silence seemed to recoil, like it couldn't fully suppress the noise. "Do it again," Eric gasped, pulling out a metal pot from his pack. He slammed it against his water bottle, creating an echoing metallic clang. Again, the sound cut through, just barely, but it was there. The air around us shuddered, like the silence itself was retreating, and I felt the pressure in my chest ease slightly. The creature, it had been closing in. I could feel it. But now it was held back. I could almost sense it, lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing, waiting for the sound to fade. "We need more noise," I muttered, my voice hoarse. I grabbed a rock and threw it against a nearby tree. It made a dull thud, but it was something. Eric followed suit, banging on the tree with whatever he could find, creating an almost rhythmic clatter. Each sound we made seemed to push the silence back just a little further. Rachel, barely conscious, stirred, her eyes fluttering open. What are you doing?" she whispered. "We're making noise," I said, my voice trembling. "It's the only way to keep it back." The silence wasn't gone, but we had weakened it. The creature was still out there, watching, waiting for the moment the noise stopped. But as long as we kept hitting, kept slamming rocks and metal together, we were holding it at bay. "Move," I yelled, my voice cracking but audible this time. "We have to get to the road, now." Eric and I hauled Rachel to her feet, staggering out of the clearing. I didn't dare look back. We kept moving, hitting rocks against trees as we went. The sounds were faint but steady, keeping the silence at bay just long enough. It was a long journey, made especially hard by the constant need to make sound, but eventually, we broke through. The moment we stepped out onto the road, it was like a veil had been lifted. The silence shattered. All at once, sound came rushing back in. The wind in the trees, the distant chirping of birds, our own ragged breaths. It hit us like a wave, disorienting and overwhelming. But it was real. We collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for air, feeling the solid ground beneath us. The weight of the silence was gone, lifted. I turned to look back at the tree line, half expecting the creature to follow. But there was nothing. No shadows, no movement, just the forest, still and quiet. But not like before, not that crushing, deadly quiet. Rachel was lying beside me, breathing heavily, her face pale but alive. Eric sat behind her, his hands shaking, his eyes still wide with the adrenaline of the escape. "We made it," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "We made it out." I nodded, but the sense of dread didn't fully lift even as I stared at the trees. We had escaped, but the forest, the silence, was still there, waiting, lurking just beyond the edge. There's this house at the end of our street. It's been abandoned for as long as I can remember. The kind of place that, as a kid, you cross the street to avoid. Everyone in the neighborhood knows it, but no one really talks about it. Except on Halloween. That's when things get weird. Every year, a bowl of candy appears on the front porch on Halloween night. It's always the same. A plain black bowl filled with the good stuff, like M&Ms and Reese's. Nothing cheap. No one's ever seen who puts it there, and no one ever stays long enough to find out. It just appears. The weird thing is, there's never any sign of life at that house the rest of the year. There are no lights, no movement, nothing. The windows are cracked, the roof is falling apart, and the yard is completely overgrown. Still, like clockwork, every Halloween, that bowl of candy is right where it always is. There's this rumor too. It's been passed around as long as I can remember, passed down from the older kids when I was younger. They say that if you take a piece of candy, you'll get good luck for the next year. A lot of kids in the neighborhood believe it. Some people think it's just a harmless tradition. Others say it's cursed. Me? I've always been somewhere in between. I didn't really buy into the whole good luck thing, but I can't deny that the house gives me this weird feeling whenever I pass it. One year, though, something changed. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The house, the candy, the fact that no one knows anything about who's putting it out all these years. I grew up hearing stories about the place. Some people say an old man used to live there. Others say he vanished years ago, leaving the house behind like a ghost town in the middle of our quiet little street. But no one really knows the truth. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that no one had ever really tried to find out. So I decided that was the year I'd do it. After the trick-or-treaters had cleared out and the streets were empty, I stayed behind. The bowl was still there, just sitting on the porch like it always did, as if it had been waiting. My friends had already gone home, and I could have followed, but something wouldn't let me. There's always been a pull to that house, something I couldn't quite explain, like it wanted someone to notice it, like it wanted someone to come inside. I told myself I'd just stay and watch, just long enough to see if anyone came to take the bowl away or refill it, just to get an answer once and for all. But the more I stood there, the more I felt it. This nagging sense of curiosity. It's like the house was calling to me, waiting for someone like me to finally step through its doors. And that night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I'd been waiting there for hours, hidden behind the bushes across the street. The neighborhood had long since gone quiet. No more kids running around in costumes, no more porch lights. Just me, the dark, and that house. The candy bowl still sat on the porch, untouched since the last group of trick-or-treaters passed by. Nothing. No movement. The house stayed still and silent as it always did. I was about to call it a night when something caught my eye. The front door creaked open, slow and deliberate, like someone on the other side had just pushed it. But I didn't see anyone. There was no wind, no explanation, just the door slowly swinging open, inviting. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself it was just old hinges giving way, but deep down, I knew better. The house wanted me to come in. I stayed as still as possible, waiting to catch a hand coming out, sneaking away the bowl as Halloween ended. Theories ran through my head, thinking it was maybe an old local who either started or was carrying on this local tradition. But nothing came out. The door stood open, and more of darkness gently breathing in the outside air. As I watched, it almost looked inviting. Invasive thoughts came in my head, pushing out the idea that someone was in there, but that I was being politely asked to come in. Nothing looked overtly threatening. Sure, the house looked musty and old, but otherwise, it was still and docile. I don't know what made me do it. In reality, I should have turned around and gone home, but I didn't. Whether I was too absorbed with figuring out this mystery or some otherworldly possession, I accepted the perceived invitation. I grabbed my flashlight and crossed the street, my feet barely making a sound on the pavement. I reached the porch, glancing once more at the candy bowl, almost expecting something to happen. But the candy just sat there, untouched. I took a deep breath and stepped through the door. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air around me felt like it changed. Thick, heavy. My skin prickled as if I just walked into a room filled with smoke. But there was no smoke. Just an overwhelming sense of pressure, like the house was pressing down on me. I shone the flashlight around, but the beam felt weak, swallowed by the darkness. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but not like normal old wood. It felt different, like something was shifting under the surface, adjusting to my weight. It looked solid, and when I tapped my foot on the floor, it was hardwood. But while walking, it just felt off. It wasn't just the ground. As I moved deeper into the house, something in the air felt off too. It wasn't just the silence or the darkness swallowing my flashlight's beam. It was the way the walls seemed to shift, only settling when my light landed straight on it. It was barely perceptible, dancing softly on the edges of my vision, too vague to ever confirm. I shook my head, chalking it up to nerves. The floor creaked with every step I took, but the creaks felt deliberate, like something beneath me was adjusting, sensing my weight. When I turned to check behind me, the door that had been open was now shut without so much as a sound. My pulse quickened, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I'd closed it out of habit. I was too in my head to keep track of everything. But then, as I turned back, the hallway seemed to stretch before me, like the space itself was bending. I stopped, shining my flashlight down the hall. I could swear it had been short, only a few steps to the next room. But now it seemed longer, as if the walls were moving, pulling me further in. It was late. I was tired. I would have preferred to have done this with a clearer head. But sadly, I could not choose the time to dive into this investigation. So, I was stuck second-guessing everything I was seeing. My stomach twisted. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the house felt alive, reacting to me, watching me. The further I ventured, the heavier everything felt. The air was thick, like I was suffocating. Each breath was harder than the last, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill. My legs felt like lead, every step taking more effort than it should. At first, I thought it was the fear catching up with me, adrenaline wearing off maybe. But this was different. I felt like I was being drained. I wiped my forehead, trying to clear my thoughts, but it didn't help. My head was foggy, like I hadn't slept in days. I checked my phone for the time. It was almost 3 a.m. I couldn't even remember what time I'd gone in, but there was no way I'd been in that long. Maybe I'd waited for longer than I thought when outside, but even then, it didn't add up. I couldn't even tell which way I came from anymore. It was like the walls seemed to twist and shift behind me, rearranging themselves the moment I wasn't looking. I shook my head, trying to clear the growing fog in my head. I could barely think straight, and my movements were slow and sluggish. It was like the house was pulling the energy right out of me, step by step. As I moved further in, I started seeing things. Clothing, old shoes, pieces of paper. Some were scattered on the floor, others abandoned in the corners of rooms. At first, I thought they were just debris from squatters, but as I looked closer, I saw all the clothes look like they belonged to children, to young teenagers. Sprinkled around were discarded remnants of old costumes, Halloween themed, all at varying ages of decay. Some looked newer, but between them were pieces that looked older than my parents. I looked at what I was wearing and came to the subtle realization these were from others who had wandered in, like me, trying to find answers to the mystery of the candy bowl. Fight or flight kicked in. Panic settled as a thought flashed in my mind. If this is what happened to the people who had come inside and never made it out, what happened to them? Because whatever it was, it couldn't be good. I picked up an old candy wrapper, its edges brittle from age. I glanced around, my flashlight catching glimpses of more wrappers, shoes and bags left behind in the dust. They were just there. No sign of a struggle, no signs of what happened to them. That's when it hit me. The candy. It wasn't just some harmless Halloween tradition. It was bait. A mystery so alluring to the young that it was the perfect way to lure people inside and draw them deeper into the house. Just like me. I turned back the way I came, desperate to leave. The door shouldn't be far. I hadn't ventured that deep into the house, had I? But when I reached the spot where the entrance should have been, it wasn't there. The door was gone, leading to an inane hallway that matched the few I'd already walked through. Panic set in. I tried another hallway, then another. Whenever I thought I was heading toward an exit, it never led to where I thought I was going, forcing me deeper into the house. It was like the place was changing around me, trapping me inside. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, searching frantically for the front door. Still, it was like the house was alive, blocking every possible escape route. I felt the floor beneath me shift, but it was worse than before. I could no longer strike it as my imagination, as it almost felt like it was melting into itself. I took another step, and my foot sank into the floor like it was quicksand. I pulled, but the floor held tight, sticky and thick, like it was pulling me down. The walls around me began to pulse, closing in. The house was tightening its grip. I slammed my fists against the walls, screaming for help, but no sound escaped. My voice was muted, swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. No one could hear me. The house absorbed everything. Something was feeding off me. The house grew more intense the weaker I felt. The harder I tried to escape, the more the house drained from me. My legs felt heavier, my breath shallow. It wasn't just fear. It was feeding on my energy, my panic. As I tried to pull myself out, trying to stay calm, I noticed something else. Shadows moving within the walls. At first, I thought it was just from the house shifting in its unnatural way. But then I saw them again. Faint human shapes flickering just behind the wallpaper, their outlines blending into the structure of the house. They weren't ghosts. They were people, trapped, unable to leave. I used my arms to pull one leg as free as possible, and what little perch I could get yanked the other out. I finally tore through the last of the membrane. I had given up on finding the door, but there was a window nearby that gave me hope. Though with how much I lost myself scrambling through the twisting hallways, I had no idea what floor I was on. But just as I was about to crawl out, I felt the house latch onto me. The walls rippled and something shot out from the floor. Tendrils of the house wrapped itself around my legs and arms, pulling me back toward the pulsing walls. I screamed, but the sound was still swallowed, vanishing into the thick air. The house wasn't letting go. The tendrils tightened, pulling me backwards, and whispers in my mind grew louder. They weren't soft. They were desperate, pleading, almost panicked. "Stay with us. Don't leave. You belong here." It sounded like pleas from children. I thrashed, trying to break free, but the harder I fought, the more it pulled, dragging me back toward the center of the room. I could feel myself fading, the strength draining from my body, the weight of the house pressing down on me. My vision blurred, and I thought about letting go for a moment. The whispers begged me to stay with them, their tone dripping with loneliness. But something inside me refused. I wasn't going to let it win. With my last burst of energy, I reached up and grabbed the edge of the window, dragging myself through. The tendrils clung to me, tearing at my skin as I pulled my legs free. They didn't let go easily. They weren't just wrapped tightly, but were lined with something adhesive. My skin felt hot wherever they touched. By the time I was halfway out, my arms were trembling, and I could feel the skin of my legs burning where the house had latched on, like it had taken pieces of me with it. Blood soaked through my clothes, and my entire body ached with a deep, searing pain. But I couldn't stop now. I gave one last yank, and with a scream, I ripped free, crashing through the window and falling a story down onto the grass. My body hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. But I was outside. I was free. I lay there, gasping for breath, my chest on fire, every inch of me screaming in pain. I glanced down at my legs, blooded, raw, the skin blackened where the house had burned me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers faded. The house went still, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The air was calm again, but I could feel it. Something inside me was different. I just lay on the cold grass, gasping for breath, my chest rising and falling like I'd just run a marathon. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating me inside the house was gone, but I wasn't free of it. My body was trembling, every muscle aching as if I'd been squeezed dry. I stared up at the sky, the stars distant and cold, trying to convince myself it was over. Slowly, I turned my head to look back at the house. It stood there, as still and silent as it had always been. Just a run-down, abandoned structure. Nothing about it seemed out of place from here. The windows were dark, lifeless, and the front porch was as empty as ever. The candy bowl still sat there, untouched, like nothing had happened at all. I could feel it, deep in my bones. It wasn't just some old building. It was alive, waiting. The dark windows seemed to watch me like eyes, following my every move. And even though I was out, I wasn't free. I tried to stand, my legs wobbling beneath me, but it felt like my body had been drained of all its strength. Every movement was a struggle, my muscles refusing to cooperate. My mind felt hazy, like a thick fog had settled over it. I tried to piece together everything that had happened inside, but something felt missing. My memories were fragmented, pieces scattered and broken. I could remember the feeling of the house tightening around me, the whispers clawing at my mind, but the details were blurred, slipping through my fingers the harder I tried to recall them. It was like part of me was still in there, trapped inside the walls, just like the people I'd seen. No matter how far I got from it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had taken something from me, something I would have to go back in to get back. It had left its mark on me. I made it home that night, but nothing felt the same. Every step I took away from that house felt like I was dragging something heavy with me, something I couldn't see. I tried telling people about it, my friends, my parents, about what happened. I also reported what I could to the police about the house. They didn't believe me. Some laughed it off like it was some kind of prank or a drug-induced memory, a wild trip from some laced candy. No one understood. No one felt what I felt in there. When I reported it, I didn't even try to explain how the house had felt alive, how it had taken something from me, because they wouldn't have believed it. They sent in a unit and found the place desolate, with a typical abandoned house layout, then lectured me on the dangers of trespassing in unstable structures. Weeks passed, and things felt like they went back to normal. But I couldn't shake it. The house, the pull, the whispers were still with me. I could feel it, even as I tried to pretend everything was fine. And the same bowl of candy was there when Halloween came around the next year, sitting on that porch just like always. Despite everything, as I stood in front of the house, seeing the locals' delight in the free candy, memories I'd forgotten flashed back through my mind. The pain sang from the scars on my legs, vividly replaying the events of that night in brief moments of clarity. And yet, despite the horrendous experience, I still felt that pull. Something deep inside me stirred. Even though I knew what the house really was, even though I knew it nearly took me, I couldn't help but look. A part of me still wanted to go back, as if the house hadn't finished what it started. I still live on that street, and as I sit in my room at night, I stare out the window, the house visible just beyond the streetlights. It's quiet now, the same stillness that always surrounded it. But as Halloween approaches, the pull is stronger than ever. Sometimes, when everything's dark and silent late at night, I can still hear it. Whispers, faint, distant, but unmistakable, calling my name, telling me to come back. I try to ignore it, try to tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I know the truth. The house isn't finished with me. I glance out the window one last time, knowing that it's just a matter of time before I can't resist the pull anymore. One day, it'll pull me back in. And next time, I'm not sure I'll be able to escape.